Good morning to everyone here today. It's our pleasure to welcome you to our webinar workshop, Making the Business Case for Diversity. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Melissa Langworthy, who is leading today's workshop and has taken the time from her busy schedule to participate in this event and impart her extensive knowledge of diversity and inclusion on the economy. We are grateful for your support of our activities and mandate, and we look forward to learning from you very shortly. I'd also like to thank NAMA Women Advancement Establishment in Sharjah, who have been programme partners since 2014. Thank you for your unwavering support, and we look forward to many more fruitful projects together. Before I start, I'd just like to give a quick introduction to the Pearl Initiative. Many of you are familiar with us. I think for those of you that aren't, I'll just give you a quick introduction. The Pearl Initiative is the leading and only independent non-profit organisation founded to promote the business case for the implementation of the highest standards in corporate governance, transparency and accountability in the Gulf region's private sector. Launched in 2010 in cooperation with the United Nations Office of Partnership, the Pearl Initiative aims to convene businesses, decision makers and future young leaders to take the lead in promoting and adopting greater governance standards. The Pearl Initiative also engages with the wider business ecosystem, collaborating with over 40 regional companies, as well as the regional educational system with over 30 regional universities. We work with them collectively to drive our mission forward. We work as a think tank and build data by publishing cutting-edge research reports and case studies to inspire business change. About today's topic, business case for diversity is a topic of great discussion both globally and regionally. In the last few years, regional companies have increasingly begun to understand the value that promoting and increasing diversity in the workplace has for improved business productivity. Global studies have repeatedly demonstrated the utility that increased diversity has for businesses and their outputs. However, we do continue to observe that businesses have a long way to go in promoting diversity within their ranks, and particularly ensuring that women who work within them are supported in a manner that benefits their careers. About the programme, stemming from this, in 2014, Pearl Initiative launched the Diversity in Business Leadership Programme. The programme builds upon the fact that good corporate governance encompasses a rigorous system spanning all aspects of accountability and business practices, including diversity in the workforce, which subsequently leads to improved business outcomes such as increased innovation, higher revenues, and an improved work culture. Gulf region organisations are taking progressive steps towards supporting women in their organisations in line with global standards. Still, much remains to be done to support women's entry and retention in the regional economy as women and organisations continue to report hurdles in the path towards women's representation in the organisations across all economic sectors. As part of our programme, we did conduct some research on the UAE economy and the Gulf region economy. And as we mentioned earlier, the programme runs in partnership with NAMA Women Advancement Establishment in Sharjah. As part of the programme, we embarked on regional research to understand the nature and extent of women's participation in the workforce. And in the course of our research, we found that women value their careers tremendously and want to learn and grow on a personal level. They want a positive organisational culture and a supportive tone from the top bolstered women's decisions to enter and remain in the workforce. Common factors that were identified as hindering women's workforce progression were gendered preconceptions of women's roles, demanding working hours and conditions, and a lack of policies supporting women's workplace advancement. We also found that the top 3 reasons for women to leave the workforce are a lack of professional advancement opportunities, a devaluation of work and effort, and the lack of a work-life balance. To translate these findings into actionable solutions, we are holding this workshop with you all today. In this workshop, we will be discussing the factors that impact women's workforce participation, the obstacles to women's economic engagement, and concrete solutions that would support women at all career stages at individual and company levels. Introducing Dr. Langworthy, it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Melissa. Dr. Melissa is a feminist economist focusing on women, work and entrepreneurship in the Gulf. She has consulted with the American University of Beirut, the Kuwait Women's Union, the EU Policy Outreach Partnership, ENV, and the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science, and is a research affiliate with Lady Smith. Her current research focuses on the relationship between women's empowerment, entrepreneurship, and the rentier state. Dr. Langworthy, welcome. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to your engaging remarks. As always, before I hand over to Dr. Melissa, I'd like to stress that the workshop is intended to be an interactive workshop, so please do pose your questions. I believe you have a panel to submit questions through. Dr. Melissa will be reading those and will answer those and address them throughout the workshop. It may be that we save some questions for later. Dr. Melissa will probably know that later on someone's question is going to get answered. So it won't be us ignoring you, but it will just be to ensure that we get through all of the material that we want to get through today and make sure you get the most out of the workshop. So thank you. Over to you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to PI and NAMA as well. This is the third in our series of workshops on business diversity in the Gulf, but it is the first one online. So as Yasmin said, we're going to be doing our best to adapt the material to keep it interesting and interactive for you all. So hopefully that we do that successfully. There are functions I hope you're aware of to kind of raise a hand or to post a question. And so those are options that will be available to you throughout the workshop. So as we go through today, we're going to follow a little bit of this outline. We started with introduction, and we'll take a moment for the icebreaker. We'll see how that works. But in the first part of the workshop, we are going to really look at the background information on the business case for diversity in the business sector, right? Diversity in the workplace, and looking at really what the research tells us, what we know about where we are globally and in the Gulf as a region, and kind of what framework exists to help us get where we need to go. And then in the second part, we're going to look more into the results of the Pearl Initiative and NAMA regional study that Yasmin wrote about. And then later on, we're going to look a little bit more specifically into organizations and workplaces and specific policy solutions that have been implemented, and kind of how to prioritize those, how to individualize those to meet the needs of your particular workplace. So when we think through this as far as objectives and what we want to do, obviously making the business case, right? Why? And there is a great business case to be made. So the fact is that diversity does pay off in terms of financial returns, in terms of business and organizational performance. And so we will cover that. We will cover the findings that really bring home this business case to the Gulf region. And then we really want to work through, as we said, the individualizing the different solutions that can be used in your own workplace, and to really understand how to address what exactly about diversity and inclusion is the goal for you and your workplace, and then what then are the policy options available to you to achieve those goals. And at the end, you know, the follow-on objective for all of this is to strengthen businesses and employees and make better workplaces. So keeping that in mind. So the question that often needs to be asked and that did actually come up in Pearl Initiative study is, you know, why are we here? It's 2020. You know, what is the space for why are we still trying to do this? Why are we still trying to promote gender diversity in the 21st century? So if you want to type in or give a question or a comment or raise your hand, I would love to hear why. Why are we still here in the 21st century? Talking about gender and diversity and all that those two terms have come to mean. Okay, no hands. Nobody wants to talk about it. Okay. Okay, fine. So just as one more administrative point, Shruti, our program assistant, might be popping in throughout the presentation to present some of your questions, as Yasmin mentioned. So. Okay, so I don't see any comments or hands. So I will just say it's worth thinking about why in the 21st century, right, the year 2020, we're still trying to talk about business diversity and gender. So one of the reasons why we're still talking about this is the fact that we still need to talk about it. The fact that, right, this is a very interesting article that came out of the New York Times about how CEOs in the United States, there are more men named John than there are women of any name, right? So 3.3% Johns are there are more John CEOs, but Johns are only 3.3% of the population, whereas women are a 50.8, more than 50% of the population, and yet underrepresented in these positions. We saw this again just this year in Davos. In Davos, there were more people just from North America than there were women from all of the countries involved. So we do see a pattern that reminds us that we need to keep asking these questions. We need to keep looking at gender and talking about diversity because we're not there yet. And you know, many of the Gulf countries, right, have made a lot of progress. So at Davos, actually, Bahrain and UAE had 12.5% women, which is an improvement. Kuwait had 16% in their delegation. Saudi had nearly 10%. So there are steps being made, but we're not quite where we want to be as far as terms like parity and equality. So things just to keep in mind as we move forward in this workshop is, you know, there are many ways to talk about these concepts, these ideas of equality or, you know, recruitment and retention and the different policies. But at the end of the day, we need to apply these things to reality. And so understanding as we speak through is, yes, there are things that are found in a research setting. There are things that are found you know, that people can share that are applicable within their environments, but that concepts and reality are not necessarily the same thing. And always, I invite you to chew on any information and the things that are presented here to see how they best reflect and fit into your own experiences. Understanding that bias isn't limited to gender. So, you know, bias can be ethnicity, it can be age, it can be nationality. So there are many, many ways that bias is impacting us in the workplace. So understanding that gender is not the only way, is not the only reason that we have these discussions. Understanding that everyone is biased. We develop bias because our brain is hardwired to try to make sense of the world around us. It's hardwired to find shortcuts that help us understand the world. And so we do this through not necessarily in a malicious way, but because it's just natural. It's how we help make sense of the world. So just, you know, understanding that bias exists for everybody. So there's no need to point fingers or to judge yourself, but we're trying to become aware. I do invite sharing stories, and I hopefully will have the opportunity for you guys to speak and to share your experiences so that, you know, that becomes part of our conversation today. And I just ask you to do so with respect to the people involved and to ensure anonymity. And obviously the stories are very valuable, but we don't need to identify people in this platform specifically. And then when you're responding and when you're sharing, just try to keep in mind, you know, try to keep the environment light and positive and non-judgmental so that we do get the maximum participation and people feel comfortable sharing their experiences. Okay, so I think that's a good place to ask for any questions before we move forward.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Melissa. So hi everyone. I'm Shruti from the Pearl Initiative. I do have a comment from someone in the attendees. A Miss Salwa Baheti says, the reason we have to talk about it is because it's not happening. It never has, and it looks like it never will, because there's no need for change when the normal suits the moment. So her question to you, Dr. Langworthy, is, how do you change entrenched behavior related to gender inequality now to make a difference to gender equity in the future?
I think my answer to that, and obviously, hopefully we'll be answering that question throughout this entire presentation. You know, I think I would argue with the concept that the normal suits the moment. Actually, I would argue that the normal suits the past, because so much of the way that we make sense of the world is imprinted on us when we're young and when we're children. And so I think that when you see kind of, you know, young professionals trying to be mothers and having families, but they want to do it in the way that they had a family, right, that they were when they were children, those same values, we're trying to imprint them on the realities of living and working and having a family today. And so I would say that the normal doesn't necessarily suit the moment, but the normal does suit the people that are benefiting from it. And so I do think that when we make conscious decisions, especially as an organization and through organizational kind of personality and policies and environments, then we're able to change what suits the moment, as you say, but we're also able to change the ways in which people gain power and the ways in which we value people in a way that will make these the mistreatment, right, will make the inequality no longer valuable as a behavior. And we've seen that across the world, right? If you look at I think it was a $12 trillion addition if you were to actually capitalize on the human resources that women have in the workforce, there could be a huge growth in productivity around the world. So going back to our business case, right, there is definitely a financial argument to be made. So maybe the normal doesn't suit the moment when we want to actually start capitalizing on these resources. So the more and more that we can make the idea that that it's not suitable, right, the more ways we can make that argument, the more I think progress we can have. So on that note, moving forward, so here is, you know, from December of this year, this is the women in the top S&P 500 companies looking at their representation. So as we said, right, the women are not there. That's just the fact that we see. And we do see that this is a trend that gets more serious as we get into leadership positions. But I also want to invite you to understand that this pyramid itself hides a lot of differences. So if we see at 5.2% of CEOs are women. Well, if you want to look at Japan, the number is half of that, right? So even within these numbers, there's going to be variation. Some countries will be doing much better than that. The 22,000 firms were surveyed around the world, and they found that 60% had no female board members at all. So even this 21% is balancing, right, those 60% that had none. So when we look at averages, understand that averages can hide a lot of things. They're nice to kind of give us something to benchmark, to understand a trend, but there'll be a lot of different experiences when we start really looking at them. And actually, there's quite a lot of progress that's being made. So in 2019, 29% of senior management, by the end of the year, 29% were held by women, which is the highest that we've ever had. So, and 87% of global businesses do have at least one woman in a senior management role. So I do think that progress is happening. And I think that sometimes we tend to focus the attention on all of the ways in which there's still more to do and forget the fact that we are actually changing things step by step. So on that note, when 1 in 10, so we want to try to think about this in terms of progress. And so when 1 in 10 senior leaders at a company is a woman, what percent of men and what percent of women think that this is enough? Think that women are then well represented in leadership. So we've got a 10% representation of women. And for this one, we do have a poll so that you can actually answer the question. Let's see if this works. And so I invite you to click what you think. So when 10% of senior leaders are women, who thinks that's enough? What percentage of men and what percentage of women reported that that is a good accomplishment. All right, we're going to go about 15 more seconds if you haven't had a chance to vote. All right, 5. Okay, you're still going. Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, I'm going to close the poll here. Okay, now. Okay, so I'll show these. I don't know how they're being shown, but it said I showed it to you. So yeah, so you as a collective, you selected the right response. So it was 44% of men were satisfied with 10% of women and only 22% of women. And so I do see that you believe that men, there is a gender difference. So if we look at our top 2 results, that the men are going to be more easily satisfied than the women. And that's actually something that we do see, and that's a very interesting gender gap to note. So thank you for participating. It was 44% of men, 22% of women. And part of what I want you to take away from this question is the fact that, you know, this idea of the token amount of women, right? Even the idea that there's going to be a threshold where it's enough is a really, really reductive way to think about these topics. And then also noting, you know, the difference between men and women in their perception, which is going to be one of the themes that we do bring with us as we move forward. And then understand too that these numbers change quite quickly, right? Here we were asking about 10% of women in senior leadership, but if they ask the same question when it's 30%, 62% of men, and then almost half of women, right? 54% of women agree. So we very, very quickly lose some of this distinction as these numbers go up. So again, so understanding numbers only capture a small part of the story. So diving into the business case then, what is it and why does it matter? Well, it matters because internationally as a community, we've decided that it matters, right? The UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, and before them, the Millennium Development Goals, as a region built into the vision plans for many of the Gulf countries. We have made a determination as a community, right, as a global community, as a regional community, that it does matter, that we do value things like inclusion and equality. As such, we've developed a number of best practices. So you've got different International Labor Organization conventions. You've got CEDAW, the Committee of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the WEPs, the Women's Empowerment Principles, and then the UN Compact. So different ways that you can, as either a country or an organization, show to your community, show to your business community and your government that you are committed to achieving these goals. So if we look at Saudi, you know, the Equal Remuneration Convention, they signed it in 1951. However, today, or I think as of last year, the pay gap for Saudi women in the private sector was still 56%. So women are earning less than half of what men are. So even when we're looking at these kinds of, yes, you can sign a lot of conventions, and make a lot of commitments, but that's not necessarily easy to translate into outcomes. And so that is just one of the points I want you. These are tools that we can use. They're tools that you can use to promote how well your company's doing. They're tools that you can use to either even get some help to make the kind of changes you want to make. But these do not equal good behavior in all cases. So when we look through all of the research on the business case and what the benefits are for companies that are able to increase their diversity, right, their gender diversity, we see, I mean, across the board in all of these areas, we see positive growth, right? We see investment performance is better when there are more women. We see return on sales. We see innovation revenue. So not just the amount of money that you're bringing in, but your ability as an organization to innovate and bring new products to the market are increased. There's a larger talent pool. There's a better decision making and obviously and objective thinking process. So there is research that shows all of these things are positively impacted by having gender diversity. And then, yeah, so McKinsey found that if all the countries in the world close their gaps to match not even equality, just the highest, the most invested level, so whatever company is the most invested in your country, if all the other companies were raised to that level, there's a $12 trillion income that could be had in the next 5 years. So understanding that there is a business case and that it exists through its positive returns in all of these areas. We're going to start looking at these a little more in depth, but understanding that it's not any one element that makes this change, that it's across elements, it's across there are multitudes of ways that gender diversity is improving the performance of companies. So when we look at this in leadership levels, we see some really great results. So a study of 27,000 senior managers globally by Credit Suisse showed that at 25% women in decision making, the cash flow returns were 4% higher. When that 25% was raised to 50%, the higher cash flow return increased to 10%. Which is quite a huge, that's quite a huge number when it comes to cash flow returns. So 10% is something many managers would want to bring to their companies. And in different notes, as I emphasized on the last slide, BCG and Munich Technical University, now this was only a European focused study, but having that diversity in management increased the revenue from new products and services. So you were more likely to be more innovative and to bring new products and services to the market, and thus increase not just number of sales, but also the scope of your operation to increase your profits. And then finally, the Peterson Institute for International Economics found that among firms that were profitable, the shift from 0 women in leadership to 30% was associated with a 15% increase in profitability. So these are just a handful of the studies that are out there that shows that having women in leadership specifically has positive impacts across all of these elements. So digging into this a little bit more, a McKinsey & Company global study of more than 1,000 companies in 12 countries found that organizations that were in the top 25% of gender diversity in executive leadership outperformed on profitability and value creation. So if we then look at in terms of our business case, and we're looking at it both in terms of profitability and then value creation, the difference between those that are the top performers in gender diversity, so the top 25%, did 21 and 27% better than those in the bottom. And then likewise, if we go to the bottom 25%, we're not doing any better than average. So, and actually, Yes, so they were not doing any better than average. So there is a positive correlation here between gender diversity on executive teams and measures of financial performance that are both, profit-based and value creation-based. So just a moment for thought here, starting to help us think through some of the ways in which these elements are actually enacted in a workplace on a day-to-day basis, right? So it's nice to sit here and talk about all this great research we have, but a lot of times the diversity elements and the issues that we face are through interpersonal interactions. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to have a few of these questions that are structured in the same way. So this first one is, you overhear a coworker complaining that your company's gender diversity efforts are just a waste of time. So the elements I want you to think about are why does this happen? Why is the coworker complaining? And then what can we do about it? And my hope is that we can actually raise hands here and have people speak to actually address these activities. Does anyone want to talk about why this might happen? Has anyone ever had this? Have you had a discussion in your workplace where somebody just says they don't think that the diversity program, they don't understand why you're doing it or why you should be doing it? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Nobody wants to talk?
Hi, I do have one question from someone in the audience. Let me just pull this up. So
Okay.
Ms. Mehta Alaway says she thinks it is because of the lack of awareness that they themselves do not understand the potential economic contribution as a whole. And Ms. Salwa Beheri says it happens typically because of the lack of understanding of what diversity is.
Yeah, that's very true. So if we can start to understand these elements that our participants were able to share, what can we do? What do we say in response?
I do have another comment. Sarvanan Dhalvoy says, because men think, especially in the energy sector, that men are more suitable for oil and gas than women.
And I would actually say that is something that is stereotypical, and that I would say it takes men and women to have that thought, right? Men have to think that it's a good thing for them to do, to be in the energy sector, and women have to have been told, right? And not told insofar as somebody sat you down and told them, but gathered through their lifetime, right? A number of messages that told them that the oil and energy sector is not a good place for them to be. And this could be, it's not ladylike, it's not, they won't hire you anyway because it's all men. You start to get these paradoxes in which, oh, well, it's a male-dominated industry, so women shouldn't be there. Well, it's only male-dominated because the women aren't there. So we start to then create that reality in some ways. And yeah, that's a very true point. And we will be talking about gender gaps in attitudes as we move forward today, because I do think that's a very important thing to stop and recognize. And a lot of it does have to do with what the first comment said was, not really understanding diversity and why we're doing it, right? Men, by virtue of certain kinds of privilege and just not having the same issues to deal with that women do, there isn't the awareness there all the time. So awesome.
I do have a few more comments from Mr.
Sure.
Rob. Mr. Ford says that he's heard from board members that there aren't enough experienced women, that men should be advocates, and Petronas and Shell Malaysia are developing women leaders in the oil and gas industry. So those are good examples.
They are very much.
Yeah.
And we will talk.
Have,
yeah, I do see a hand here as well. Salwa, can we try to let her?
Yes, absolutely.
Let's see. Salwa, do you want to comment? I'm trying to unmute you. Let's see. Unmute. There. Hello?
Hello?
Hello, Salwa.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. It occurred to me that in my experience, it has mostly been a little bit of insecurity by men because they fear the competition. Women come into the market, a lot of women tend to have a little bit of a chip on the shoulder because they have to prove themselves, right? So they tend to work twice as hard, et cetera, et cetera. And men have enough competition amongst themselves. So it just is fear of competition, of competence. That's how I see it. It's a simple, basic, competitiveness on the part of men and some women as well.
Well, true. The more people we put into the workforce, right? Yes, there is higher competition. But I do also think that it's not necessarily men and women, right? It's not that easy to divide the experience of the fear of competition by gender, because we also see that a lot of the women that make early gains, a lot of the early women that we've had in leadership positions, don't necessarily think other women can do it. Right? They've gotten to that point in a lot of ways by distinguishing themselves and by rejecting, by trying to be masculine or trying to emulate what they need for success. So there's not necessarily an easy connection either between having a woman in a leadership position and things changing, right? There's no equal relationship there. So yeah, but no, great. Definitely. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
We do have someone else in the audience, Ms. Kifa. I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, good morning, ladies. I
Good
hope
morning.
you can. Yes, just to what Robert mentioned, we work together. I'm one of the senior, let's say, management member that I always struggle to find my way to become a board member. The reason is two things. I don't think we have the right forums to be trained to become a successful board members. It's not about us as a woman, but if the companies or the decision makers on boards can give us the suitable training, I'm sure you will find lots of successful board members as a woman. The other challenge I personally find, especially being a single working mother, whenever I spoke to my management, they find it difficult, like, you have kids, you will not be able to travel, you will not be able to be in a higher position in the leadership. And this is something sometimes it annoys, because as long as you give the chance for all of these women that are eager to be on leadership positions and prove themselves, nothing else matters, whether you're a single mom, whether you have kids. It's just giving the chance for us and being given the training as well to be such a successful board members. That's my insights on this from experience.
And both really excellent insights. Thank you. Yes, you're right. And I think to speak to the training issue, what we're going to talk about a little bit later is the fact that, yes, organizational environments need to change, but they also should be changing, right? Because a single father, right? A single father wouldn't be cut off in the same way that a single mother is. And so it's not necessarily the idea. What we need to shift is the idea of everybody being a person that has these responsibilities that need to be balanced with work, rather than throwing the brunt onto women. And this is one of the things that's been hurting and holding back the US for a very long time. Is there was actually a call in the 70s for kind of the kind of governmental support for childcare and early childhood education that would take off a lot of that stress. And basically what happened was this idea that, oh, well, we don't want to make it too easy for women to go to work, right? We want to value the family. And in some ways, so a lot of us still have these ideas that in some ways bringing women in is actually in some way diminishing their family. And so these are some of the kind of really deep-seated ideas that impact us, maybe without us even knowing. And so, yeah, so understanding that that maternity, paternity is something that's evenly shared, and included in that is going to be opening up options for paternity and for men to seek a different work-life balance. So all really great comments, thank you. So yes, so when we're looking at this, you know, we're looking at the idea of meritocracy. So we're looking at the idea that women will somehow be lesser than, and potentially, right, that if I'm focusing on bringing women in, then by definition, they won't have a lot of skill, the same level of skill. This idea that women are going to be brought in just, again, to be tokens just because they're women, which we'll see in the research a little bit later on. And then what to do about it, right? So just as we've sort of shared today, right? So explaining how diversity improves results, and how it actually, you can actually increase outcomes. You actually increase that meritocratic ideal that you have when you've got really the best people, rather than, you know, letting these identity politics drive you. So wonderful, thank you all. And I'm happy we're getting the participation. So what does this look like? There are three major, you've probably heard these terms. I'll give you a second to kind of match them. So I've mixed up the terms and the definitions. But we have the glass walls, the broken rung, and the glass ceiling. And so most people are familiar with the glass ceiling, which is the fact that women remain underrepresented at senior levels, but not so much with the glass walls and the broken rung. So the broken rung is this idea that the step up to manager is the biggest obstacle that women face. And then the idea of glass walls, which is actually something we see quite a bit in the Gulf region, is that, you know, women, there's an occupational or a sectoral segregation that happens, and so this speaks to the comment about women in the energy sector, that is not so women would tend towards maybe HR or maybe administrative positions instead of engineering positions, and the ways that we see different segregation within the workforce happening. So all of these things are happening. Glass ceiling's been around for about 40 years, that term, but glass walls and broken rung are a bit newer. So speaking to that broken rung, because this really is important, especially when you're looking from an organizational point of view, what we see is that in the entry level, the gender differences actually aren't that big. If we look at, you know, male versus female at that entry level. But where we do see a huge, the first huge cut is in that first promotion, that first step into management. And so what this picture is showing is the blue dots are women and the purple dots are men, and then the purple box is showing you that if it was equal, right? This would be the way the dots were filled if it was equal. So we see a little bit of spillover at the entry level, but then a huge spillover at the first level that maintains itself, you know, as you go up in the ranks of an organization. And you can see that again here. This is looking at it between women being promoted from within a company and women being hired outside a company. So even this idea of promotion, which is something that your organization, this is something that you can control, is how you promote. So yes, we see the broken rung at that first step to manager, but then we see how actually the likelihood that you're going to promote from within for these higher and higher levels is something that is not necessarily true at the highest level. So we get to the C-suite there, and we see that actually there are more outside hires than women promoted from within, which could speak to the training comments that we had earlier, right? And really getting the women in your organization ready to be leaders, the kind of leaders that you're looking for. And then, so understanding too that, I mean, these issues are multifaceted. And so understanding that the way that we, just like we've been discussing, the way that we assign an explanation to the behavior that we see matters. So in this graphic, it's showing that when that research asked HR people, HR leaders, what the biggest challenge was, you know, you had that women don't receive sponsorship, or that there's too few women in the pipeline, right? When they asked men what the biggest challenges were, you know, okay, they said there was a pipeline issue as well, and then there were different standards. But when they asked women, right, they're the less likely to be promoted. The biggest challenges are different. And so understanding that the solutions that we're going to select to address these issues are going to be based on what explanation we believe. And often those explanations are not entirely correct, or they're not representing the full picture. So really, you know, what I wanted to take away from this as kind of an opening to this workshop is, you know, this idea of the tokenism, the idea that just having women bodies in positions is really not helping us in a lot of ways, as a global industry, right? As a community that's trying to bring daily meaning to words like diversity and equality. Greater impacts can be made by focusing on women in the middle of their careers. So a lot of times the focus is on recruitment, but the broken wrong policy shows us that that's not necessarily, on average, the biggest problem. It might be for your organization, so those are things to pay attention to. And that really supportive family and childcare policies are wanted and more sustainable than quota or token changes. So we'll start talking about this, but there is a study that shows that that actually it's not necessarily just maternity leave that has impacts on women being able to get it to the top levels of management. It's organizational perception of work-life balance. So actually the research shows that paternity leave is more strongly correlated with women in the top levels in the boardroom than maternity leave, because the paternity leave shows an organizational focus on work-life balance that goes beyond kind of focusing on just women, in equating women with family. So understanding that these kinds of results that we're looking for are going to come from a lot of different ways, a lot of different places, and they're going to include mentorship. We're going to include, you know, skill diversity and decreasing discrimination to help get women into those leadership positions. But that this doesn't just happen, you know, this happens in the organization, but it also happens in society, right? And so understanding that our workers and ourselves are going out into the world and then coming back into our organization. And there is a point at which, you know, the acceptance of gender diversity outside impacts what you're doing in your organization. And obviously we would want those to change in tandem, but that's not necessarily the world that we live in. So if you hear someone recommend that one woman should be added to each team to increase diversity, right? So this speaks to that tokenistic, habit that we have of dealing with diversity. Why would this happen, and what do you do about it if you hear someone say, well, let's just add one person to each team? And please, opening up the floor to comments.
Yeah. Dr. Langworthy, we have a question from earlier on in the session, so I think
sure.
if you could answer this while everyone's sending in their other questions.
Perfect.
We have Ms. Alia Busamra, who asks, what are the different factors that affect women's actual behavior and performance at top positions in the oil and gas industries, and the real reasons that prevent women from reaching the top positions in organizations? We're getting a lot of oil and gas questions here today.
And I hope I do want to, all of the oil and gas people, we do have there is a sector case study just after the presentation of the NAMA results. So there will be space and time in this workshop to look specifically at the issues with women in the oil and gas sector. I think that I probably won't answer that question right now, but I do invite, I will say that understanding that even the oil and gas industry is within kind of this wider social community, and so understanding that national level attitudes. I mean, for women, it can go down to just what scope was presented to you when you were a child. How did your family encourage you or not, right? Did you have the right mentor? There's a million reasons why the women that are at the top in the oil and gas industry got there, and they could be individual, they could be environmental, it could be the right mentor that they had coming up into the ranks. It could be tokenistic. They could have, part of the reason they got where they were was they were picked because they were a woman. There are many, many, many reasons why we see it. And none of those things are good or bad. It's just they reflect the experiences that people are having today. But we are definitely going to talk about oil and gas in the next little while, in probably an hour or so.
All right.
So we're there.
We also have another question from Salwa again. She asks, have you approached the law question yet? It's illegal in many countries to discriminate on gender. However, we also know the law is being flouted constantly in organizations worldwide. So what should participants do about this?
Right. And so we did have the slide back here where we started talking about different legal constructions, and obviously these are voluntary, but yes, national laws fit into this same thing as well. And yes, signing on, even non-discrimination. So whether it's a national law or it's a non-discrimination policy within your organization, yeah, just having the policy, unless there is really strong buy-in and really strong support built in to monitor and ensure that the outcomes are happening for people in their lived experience, yeah, it makes a difference. And so, yeah, so just having the policies doesn't necessarily mean that positive changes will happen unless you're very vigilant. And actually there is also a strong potential that having such policies tends to cover the problem rather than fix it. And so this would be something akin to, me going to Shruti and saying, oh, Ms. Shruti, my boss, I'm being discriminated against. And she says, oh, well, that doesn't happen because it's our policy that we don't discriminate, right? So again, understanding, and this being one of the key things that I want you to just put on to help understand this entire conversation today, that policies are only one step. And really, policies, though, have to be given to people and enacted on people and in organizations, whether that's, a national government level or a business level. And so whatever change you do will have to go beyond just a policy, right? To really making sure there's a framework that this policy is going to be implemented true to the personality, true to the objectives of the policy. But if we take this back to tokenism, did anyone want to talk about responding to this particular interaction?
I think we have a couple of hands up.
Okay.
Ms. Rola Thabit, I'm going to unmute you if that's all right, and you can speak directly with Dr. Langworthy. Oh, it looks like you're self-muted. If you'd like to speak, would you mind unmuting yourself, Ms. Rola? All right, looks like, yeah.
Okay. How about
you
Robert?
can send through the question, though. I'm happy to read it out if that's more comfortable.
Okay. We want to let Robert speak?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to unmute him. There you go.
Okay.
Hi, Rob.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi.
Perfect. Hi. Speaking to your point regarding tokenism, I think businesses need to start somewhere. So if they don't have any program or they're not doing anything. Sometimes getting the psyche of management and the leadership involved and tone from the top is very important. But I think it's very lonely place for women who get appointed when it comes to tokenism, and then you've got the effect of positive discrimination. So though they're there as a token, they then are positively discriminated against, and I think that's a big problem. And I think if you've only got one female there, it's a very lonely place. There should at least be two, and there's been some research in regards to performance in senior management and at the board level to at least having two women. Worldwide, we look at the US and the UK and how they've developed their frameworks, but still they're far behind. Unfortunately, women are underrepresented both at senior management and at the board. But I agree with you that there seems to be that missing rung. Quite often, women, I feel, from my personal experience of living and working in the UK and with multinational companies, and also living in Middle East and Malaysia, I see that sometimes women are actually held down in lower positions because they're extremely good at what they do, and people don't want them to move up to the next level, which is unfair. And I think there's fear definitely from the male point of view of enabling or empowering. I don't know if that's the right word, because women are already empowered, but having at least the mindset, and I think that needs to come really from the tone from the top. A policy, a procedure, a law, a regulation doesn't go far enough, and I think women need to feel that they're welcome, that they're part, that it's a team collaboration across the whole organization. And in many industries, if we look at, women are actually 70% consumer, the main people that buy products, etc. But they're underrepresented if we look at the cosmetic industry and the fashion and retail. Still, why are the mainly male-driven senior executives and boards, when it's actually a very gender-specific industry that's more focused on women anyway? I mean, there's a slight aspect of male there, but mainly it's women. So I think tokenism is negative, but I think companies and countries need to start somewhere. But whether or not there should be a quota, because I was attending a conference a couple of years ago where you had some prominent female leaders there who said they didn't believe in quotas, and they said the time had moved on, and unfortunately nothing had changed in regards to women being appointed into the senior executive roles and the board. So their view had, over the 2 or 3 years since they were last asked, they said that their view now was that unless something changed and there was a quota, unfortunately women won't get the opportunity. And I think one of your speakers, I think it was Kaifa, said, how do women get into the board positions? And I've spoken to here in Dubai, I've spoken to a number of Emirati women who want to get onto the boards and have even put themselves forward, but they just haven't been voted onto the board. So there could be a space there for organizations like Pearl and Nama to help with the whole branding side of things, getting women to understand that there is some they have to push themselves forward. Normally men are the ones that are egotistical and pushing themselves forward, whereas women want to be 100% prepared, 100% ready, 100%. And I don't think in order to take your first board position, no one's ever going to be 100% ready. And men generally are unlikely to say that they're not ready. They'll still step forward and they'll put both hands up to say, pick me, whereas females seem to be less egotistical. I I mean, obviously that's a generalization, but generally the case, and they normally want to be perfect. And I think it's a shame that men are not allowing the opportunity of diversity in the various leadership positions. And what's your view? I don't know from your research, but what's your view in regards to the biggest way to get women into positions? Is it that it should be driven by men, or should it really be driven by women, or should it be a combination of women and men both driving for change?
Of course. Well, that's a great, thank you for that's a great collection of observations that are all very on topic, and we'll be speaking about many of them. They'll come back up throughout this presentation. So thank you, Robert. My answer to that is the way that I really urge people to think about this is really in an environment, and in creating a better work environment for men and women, you will help push things like diversity to their natural ends, right? As you said, and this was the response to the question here is, when we talk about tokenism, I mean, yes, that one woman, these women end up being called the onlys. There is a name for them, and yes, the performance is very stressed because they're underrepresented, they're too spread out, they may be unwelcome, because what kind of a message are you sending as a manager if you're hiring someone only because she's a woman? So then that team element, right, the maybe the natural aversion that the other team members, potentially male, would have to that person, right, really impacts their potential to have the potential for the woman to actually bring any kind of change. And so yes, as some of the women you've spoken about and spoken to have told you, right, it's actually quite frustrating. So what's the difference, right? We had women there and it didn't do anything. Well, they didn't do much because they weren't really in an environment in which they were going to be able to have an impact. And so this is where this idea of the quota does start to be discussed. And now understanding needs to be made that there are different kinds of quotas, and we won't spend too much on this, but you can have a quota as far as hiring, or as far as consideration, right? In the candidate pool, you need to have 30% women, 50% women. And we do actually see really great, great outcomes from that kind of a policy, right? If you force people to consider women where maybe something just not being familiar, maybe just not having interacted with them, maybe just a bias about not considering women, if you take that away when putting together a candidate poll and make a very specific effort to say, are there women that should be on this list? We tend to find really good results from that. And this is not just business, this is everywhere. The Nobel Prize Committee actually, they went from being able to submit one name, the committee members, to 3 names. And in increasing the number of people that they can submit, you went from that one person being mostly male to an 85% increase to female representation when they were able to present not just their first biased opinion, right? This idea of greatness and genius that we have because generally men are the ones that have been put forward in these sectors. But actually women are in there too, just generally in a secondary position. And so we've seen this in Kuwait in the voting, that in 2009, when every citizen had 4 votes for their national assembly, you had the most women. You had 4 women elected in the first year that they were eligible. But after they switched to a 1 person, 1 vote, and the Kuwaitis have never been able to get another woman on board. And so sometimes this idea of quota setting, right, this idea of just giving people a little more space to present candidates and to consider candidates does give much more equitable outcomes. And then to speak to your point, Robert, on the women's self-promotion is something we will talk about coming forward that, yeah, there are things, there are ways that women are blocked from the outside, right? Management not considering them, the ways in which femininity and women's association with family are used to kind of undervalue their experiences. But also women themselves, understanding that women themselves have been raised, like you said, to be perfect from a little girl, right? Don't take risks, don't put yourself out there, be pretty, be polite, be, you know, all the ways in which children collect messages that are shaping kind of how we interpret then these opportunities as we're adults. And so there was just a study of I think it was on LinkedIn of you know, women that said that women will only apply to a position if they meet 100% of the requirements that are outlined, whereas men apply if they meet 60%. So again, that idea of, you know, you don't have to be the perfect candidate, that there is some space, isn't really part of the female behavior that we see, you know, on average. So yes, all of those things are going to go through. This all helps us understand why this idea of just putting female bodies on teams doesn't necessarily help. And in this case of the onlys, it can actually be a bit against the point, right? It could not help change anything. So, and provide a really bad working environment for those women. So we've already mentioned some of these social factors. The fact that, you know, national attitudes towards gender equality are going to have a very big impact on the ways in which policies, even at the organizational level, are implemented, right? The level of resistance you might get from your employees and from your managers. So understanding how, you know, again, what happens in our organization is not necessarily, there are many elements outside that are going to impact your ability to enact and to see outcomes of these kinds of policies. And so the first one that I want to look at, we've mentioned a little bit, is this idea of the gender gaps in attitudes. And regionally speaking, Kuwait takes the cake, so to speak. The ILO and Gallup did a poll not too long ago in 2017, and Kuwait actually, so they were asking, you know, is it acceptable for women to be in paid work? And Kuwait actually is the world leader in the gap between what women think is acceptable and what men think is acceptable. And so we see in these results that there was a 32%, so nearly a third of, there was a gap of a third in that acceptance of women being able to go to paid work. And so, yes, we can look at the fact that in the Kuwaiti constitution, there is a right to work, right? We can look at the fact that, you know, Kuwait is signed on to CEDAW. We can look at the fact that, yes, there are these policies in place that say this shouldn't happen. But the fact is, you don't change people's attitudes, right? Those policies don't necessarily change attitudes. And so you then have to enact your, you know, you have to be ready when you're trying to approach these policies from an organizational level to understand that the people that you're dealing with may or may not be accepting of the value you're trying to share in this policy. And that this is going to matter, right? This is also something that will come into the decisions that are being made by the women that you might want to hire, right? If their family may not approve of what they're trying to do, I mean, that is a weight that the women are carrying that the men aren't going to carry as well. So, so that these social elements really do impact, you know, women's ability to participate, but also the ways in which they are being interpreted, the ways in which they're being judged by maybe managers, right? Because men are more likely to be managers at this point. This could come into some of those organizational efforts that you're trying to make. Now, this is not a regional thing, right? Kuwait was a standout in terms of the globe, really. But when it came to UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, you know, we didn't see these kinds of gaps, and actually Saudi the gap was about 15%. So then we start getting, you know, a lot less resistance to potential resistance to equality and diversity measures. As Robert brought up, and we touched on just a bit, women's propensity to not self-promote. women are less likely to provide favorable assessments of their own performance, and employers don't correct for this. So as we so we hear a lot about kind of, for lack of a better word, right, just because it's the terminology, kind of the bitch boss, or the women that are too aggressive, or the ways in which women are potentially labeled, that are social. Those are examples of social elements that are creating female behavior in the workplace. And so if I fear that backlash, I'm going to be less likely to step forward, right? If I'm the only woman on a team, I'm not going to step forward and promote myself because I'm already, right, balancing, I want to be seen as a team player, so that I can keep the harmony, or so I can be successful in my current work environment. And so the issue is not so much that women are not self-promoting, which we can link back to kind of all of those tiny messages, right? Those millions of messages that young girls and young women get about pushing, bringing attention to themselves, and how it might not be feminine, or it might not be, a classy thing to do in a way that maybe boys aren't held to that standard. But also we see this in the workplace then, that, the employers don't correct for it. So if I'm judging just based on what I see in self-promotion, instead of understanding, right, maybe going to women to say, hey, let's have a talk, and maybe in this one-on-one environment, I will get a better understanding. You'll be able to promote yourself in a different environment, right? If we structure this interview, maybe if we make it an email instead of sitting in a group meeting, right? So there might be small ways to nudge women into being better at self-promoting. But the reality is the sum total of women's experiences throughout their lives have led to this behavioral trend that we see, that that women are less likely to promote, because we know that when we do, we face more backlash, and that this actually, while it's an individual behavior, it ends up having quite severe outcomes in terms of women's promotion and ability to move forward in their jobs. But again, these are things that can be, yes, so you could say then that if I as an individual woman don't self-promote, that's an individual choice. You say, okay, but it's a choice based on the environment that I see myself in. And so there has been research on the behavioral economics side that says these small nudges can help. And so, there was one company that saw increase in women's self-promotion after they sent out an email that said, oh, we don't have as many female candidates. We actually want more females to throw themselves into this hiring process. And so there are ways then to show actually we value women, we want to see women here, so please then promote yourself, which are shown to counteract this to some extent. Shruti, I see Salwa has a question. Do we want to?
Yeah, let me unmute her.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, Salwa, go ahead. I think you're self-muted, Salwa. If you would like to speak, just let me know. Or you can send through the question and then I can address that.
Okay, should I keep going then?
Sure.
Okay. So something else that we've identified just as a trend among women in the workplace is the ambition gap. And so this idea that, women just, this is where kind of women's connection with family and parenting comes to play very strongly. Is, a lot of people will say, well, she's only here until she gets married, or she's not going to be able to be committed to her job once she because of her family responsibilities. And actually research doesn't show this at all. So in quite a large study of 2,000 respondents globally, women start their careers with as much ambition as men, right? Especially when we're looking at the professional level. You don't invest your time into work and into education and then into a job search, into interviewing and getting a job just to walk away. That's not the driving force. At the early career stage, women they do want the careers that men want. But what we see is that both men and women then become challenged by meeting the job responsibilities and family life. And when we find that with men and women, but then we add to that social element of the expectations on women's roles versus men's in the household. And this is where we start to see that friction, right? Where men are able to then continue, and we see the women dropping out. Many would argue that men can only continue because the women drop out, right? That a lot of workplaces are organized around this idea of the wife, right? That there is somebody at home doing all of these things. And so a female worker and a male worker would both need this person at home to be successful. And so, but women would then see, again, on average, women would have a harder time doing that because of the ways in which men are resistant to taking over the family roles, right? So if the men are less likely to do it, the women will struggle more to balance. So yes, we can say it's an ambition gap, but actually men and women are facing these difficulties at the same rate. Women just have fewer options to balance them. And so what really this shows us as far as an organizational culture is making it easier for men and women to do both, right? To balance home and life work will open up more opportunities for women, right? If we stop as managers assuming that there are these people, you know, that we don't have to deal with what happens in the household with the, you know, doctor's appointments and school and all of that, then we stop judging our employees against that norm. And then this can open some space to be more equitable in the ways in which we judge employees. And so, you know, this has been shown in the research as well, that actually, if you see the right culture, then can boost the ambition. And it says boost the ambition level, but you're really just allowing people to progress in the way that they would have progressed without barriers. And so the researchers said, you know, they concluded ambition is not a fixed attribute, but it's nurtured or damaged by the daily interactions, conversations, and opportunities that women face over time. And so what we found is that in the companies that have the most progress in gender diversity, they also have the highest number of respondents that are seeking promotion, right? That want to make that next step because they feel like they'll be able to without kind of these barriers. So if they see other women, let's say this, that the companies that make the least progress on gender diversity, only 66% of women want a promotion. But if you've seen other women, you know, kind of not be successful within that working environment, then the understanding, right, that soft message gets passed down that I won't be able to do it either. And so then this is where we start to see that ambition being damaged by the working culture. And then finally, something that we've touched on already, and we will a little bit again, is the idea of male-dominated industries. And in 2017, yes, male-dominated industries tend to be very, very male-dominated. So only 6.6% of women were full-time in a male-dominated occupation. But we do see that there's impacts on the gender pay gap and segregation. So one of the ways that this has played out is in the United States. As more men have become nurses, actually the gender pay gap in nursing is going down. Because it was, you know, men are getting paid higher wages, and thus nursing is becoming more valuable as a vocation, which you could also argue there's a nursing shortage, so there's a supply and demand happening as well. But we are seeing that the more men, now that it's not just a female thing, the more men that are coming in, the women's pay is getting a bit higher. but yeah, but there are challenges for women in these industries, and again, this idea of the stereotype of, you know, of she's gonna, you know, do all the dishes. This is, you know, the housekeeper. So men will, well, not men, but the organizational culture can replicate some of these gender roles for women that are in male-dominated industries. Women can be seen as outsiders. Again, this idea of work-life balance, where the women employee might be, you know, juggling more things than the men on average. Harassment, lack of mentoring, which is something we'll talk about a lot in the second half. And then the ways that women respond, because we need defense, right? We need coping mechanisms to operate in our environments. And so distancing themselves, right? Not putting themselves into situations of backlash, which would be something like the self-promotion. Trying to act like one of the boys, which is something that we see when we look at, oh, well, we already have a woman, but she's not making any difference. Well, yes, because she's reacting to her environment. And so being accepted in her team is going to help her. Potentially her mental calculus is telling her, right, that building camaraderie with my colleagues is going to help me more in the long term than trying to, you know, move forward, to be seen as stepping on them to promote myself. And then obviously they could just leave, right? And then this is where people say women can't cut it, or they, you know, they don't have the same skills as men, or if she was just hired because she was a woman, she can't actually do the job. Well, there could be a lot of reasons why she left, and yet again, the story that we tell, the thing that we choose to explain it, reflects a lot around the biases and the understanding we have. So, and keep in mind that when we're talking male-dominated industries, we're not talking, you know, 90% men. We're talking about 75% or more. So this is still, so domination is not, you know, you're the only woman. It could just be one of few, and you could still face all of these challenges. So if your coworker turned to you and said, you know, I think it's easier to work with men, which very well could have happened to you in the past. Again, why does this happen, and what can we do about it?
Hi, I encourage everyone to raise their hands in the application if you'd like to speak directly with Dr. Langworthy, or send through a question and I'll read it out for her to answer. Thank you.
So no, but you're telling me nobody here has ever had someone be like, nah, it's easier. Men are easier.
So why don't I go ahead? I'll kickstart this. I've definitely heard this at an internship or two that I have had in the past.
Okay, and so, I mean, why did you understand why people were explaining it that way?
It really just boiled down to, it was a form of discrimination, I would say. And particularly as an intern, where the power dynamics are quite different when you're an intern and you're a full-time employee, that was disheartening to hear. It made me wonder, like, I don't want to speak on behalf of other women, but it made me wonder what my place was in that organization and whether my contributions were being taken seriously.
Yeah, very true. All right. So if we start to unpack this a little bit more, you know, this happens for many reasons, and they could be individual, right? They could just be something that individual person experienced. But when we look at it in an aggregate, right, incorporating assumptions that men are more competent than women, right? So this idea of the token, I'd rather just work with men because men get the job done. Considering competent women less likable and then harder to work with. So you often get that that work personality, that friction of women, the way that women work and the way that men work. Or if there's only one or two women in the office space, then having the environment actually be open for them. feeling like if the woman's there, I can't make the jokes I want, or I can't, right, speak the way that I want. And so sometimes this comes out in these kinds of comments. And then we have the bias on working with people like us, right? We like people that are like us, that makes us feel comfortable. And so sometimes learning to work with people that are different, if you're not used to it, can be a process in itself. And so if this happens, right, there's different ways to deal with it. You can ask them why they think, and then deal with the specific, whatever the specific example is that inspired them to make the comment. You can explain to them why, right? Why they might think that way and how bias works. And then maybe you have like Shruti, right? You say, well, actually, somebody said that to me once, and it really it made me undermine my entire value and how much I was included in my workspace, which is a really important element of working. Everybody wants to be in a space that they feel comfortable and valued. So if we take this a bit further to say a colleague confides that they're frustrated that a woman is taking her full maternity leave when it's a really busy time for the company. Has this happened to anybody? Have we heard comments about there are very real biological family requirements when it comes to the female body. So often, these are things from a business perspective, though, that they can be a little bit, they can raise some ire, so to speak. So why would somebody make this comment, and what can we do about it?
We have two comments from the previous session that I wanted to point out. So Ms. Laura Ba says, one common bias that women are perceived to be more emotional, which makes them more difficult to work with. And Saravanan says, men think that they would be able to spend more time to complete work in office, while women might have home commitments and not be able to spend extra hours in the office.
Right. No, very true. And again, we have these shortcuts. We have these understandings, these stereotypes for a reason. Because it is the process that we've already gone through, right? To speak to our earlier conversation, that it's not the normal for this moment, it's the normal from before. But the truth is that a lot of families and a lot of couples are balancing two careers. The truth is that economically, right, it's more imperative for families to have two incomes. And so families are doing more to make that balance work. And yet women are still being seen as shouldering all of that housework themselves. And so this is where we get to see that idea that there is a lot of change, but a lot of times, again, mostly men, because they're in the decision-making power at this point, on average, the men, right, the ways in which we think and the things that we attribute to individuals may not reflect their reality, and yet they're still bearing kind of this brunt. Women have to carry their household with them to work, whether or not those demands are real. But also men could have those demands as well, especially with the way households are changing and dividing responsibilities. So learning to understand that that's a stereotype that could easily be put to men, and really as an organization understanding work and life happen to all of your workers and making that balance as easy as possible is a good policy objective to have. So great comments, thank you guys. So what about this idea of maternity leave? Because this is very real, it doesn't go away, it is gendered because it happens to women. And there's not much we can do about that. So this is one of those areas where it is very important to have the right organizational culture around these topics. So does anyone want to comment on this particular example? Well, here, I can get the conversation started, and if you have things to add, please do. So a lot of times maternity leave is viewed as something that's either unnecessary or unfair. Again, we talk about, we had the comment about national policies. So you know, this is where public sector and private sector sometimes have friction, is if the government has allowed a certain amount of time, and that's difficult for companies to actually provide and to finance, especially if they're smaller or medium-sized companies, then this can be maternity leave can be a really polarizing and a really critical issue. And so then there's assumptions that, you know, well, she's just not going to come back, right? Which you can't say that that's never happened, but you know, but the bias that you're showing towards a female employee on the assumption that it will happen or not is where that unfairness really comes in. So one of the things that's really happening these days is, you know, having also paternity leave and family leave of different kinds available to employees, so that the weight of this kind of leave is not, it's not only women, because a lot of what we've seen is, especially in hiring, right? If you have a young woman and a young man, I mean, many managers, they think, well, but the woman might, you know, go off in the future and you know, take their maternity leave. So doing the best that we can to equalize that cost so that we're not just putting a female face on it. Number one, helps to make organizations better in for all of their employees, because I mean, the leave could be, you know, taking care of a sick parent, and it could be a son that goes to do that. It could be the paternity leave, even a couple of weeks, but even that couple of weeks helps to equalize it so that this idea of family leave doesn't just have a female face. Economically speaking, because that's my background, right? The replication of workers, we as an entire society have an interest in there being new people, and there being new people that are born healthy and you know, active and able to learn, that will then become, right, the workers that are helping to pay my retirement benefits, that are becoming our consumers for our company. So you know, the production of children is not necessarily just a female thing, as much as we've liked to, you know, to put that on. And I say we because I come from the US, and we are the worst industrial country when it comes to, you know, and worse than many non-industrial companies when it comes to recognition of maternity and family leave. So just understanding that, again, even maternity is something that we can adapt in an organization, so that, again, it doesn't have just a female face, and we're not unduly penalizing female employees because of it. Okay, so that kind of
questions. Would you mind if I unmuted some people, Doctor?
Not at all. Not at all.
Salwa's got her hand up, I think. Hi, Salwa. There you go.
Hello, can you hear me now? I'm sorry, I keep asking questions.
No, please.
Okay, so very quickly, just a personal experience when you're talking about maternity and so on. 15 years ago, I got hired into a working environment where I was the only female, and they've never had a female of childbearing age in that environment. So I ended up basically having to prove that I can continue to do everything that was done by everybody else while I was, you know, heading off to the ward for a cesarean section and back in 3 days to finish off what I started. Now, I'm not going to say that wasn't a bad experience. It was pretty bad. However, I could also see why my colleagues would not appreciate or respect thinking that a woman comes in, they get paid, and they go off and have a personal thing, which is go off and have their own kids for their own, you know, life.
Right.
The end result of that, eventually, my environment now has maternity leave for women, you know, who are coming in. We have a few more women, etc. But what I got out of that at the end of it was they could see that we could do it twice as well and twice as competent, but it put so much pressure on me, and I can see how it would put pressure on younger women coming in this day and age. That was the only comment that I wanted to add.
Wow, what an amazing personal experience to have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Was there another one, Shruti? I see Iman wants to speak.
Yes, she may send her comment through, but we can continue.
Okay, so at this point, just preparing us for understanding the Pearl Initiative and NAMA results. I want to take this conversation, just narrow it a bit to the Gulf. So there is this term, the MENA paradox, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I have another little question so we can see what you think and how familiar you are with the MENA paradox. Poll must be closed. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So it looks like you guys are fairly well versed on this paradox. We'll give it just a little bit longer. All right, I'll shut it in about 10 seconds if you want to contribute, but everyone's picked the right answer, so we're not getting a whole lot out of this question, but that's good to know. So I'm going to close the responses. Okay, so yeah, so the MENA paradox it's to do with the high educational achievements in the region, but that are juxtaposed in an environment where women are much more likely to be unemployed than men. And when women do look, they're 2 times as likely to not get the jobs. So this isn't just the fact that women are unemployed because they're staying home. It's the fact that even when they're going out for jobs, they're less likely to get them. And so we see then that, especially in this region, it's not necessarily the qualifications, but other issues that are at play in the numbers that we see. So when we look at this from a just a numbers point of view, we have the Gulf countries are among some of the bottom ranking countries from the World Economic Forum when it comes to economic participation and opportunity. We see that this has actually gotten worse over time if we compare the 2020 ranking on the left with the 2006 ranking on the right. And yet we do see some countries that have quite high female labor force participation rates. So if we look at Kuwait and Bahrain, for example, and even UAE, very, very high participation in the labor market. And yet this idea of economic opportunities is still quite low by global standards. So we see this MENA paradox in operation here. And obviously, once we start adding on some of the social barriers, when we look at married Arab women and then women in leadership, we see that even these high participation rates are not bringing equal outcomes to women. They're again not putting women into the seats that we want them to be in. So when we look at policies, as was brought up earlier, legal and social barriers that limit women's access to employment cost the economies of the MENA countries. So this is not Gulf, but it's a MENA statistic. An estimated $575 billion. In a lot of ways you see in the Gulf countries the preference for working in the public sector instead of the private sector. And a lot of times it's because of these policies like maternity. There's less friction, there's less resentment to women in the public sector, which I know Kuwait, I know Saudi has this quite a bit. This is why we see women choosing to work in the public sector over the private sector. We see these policy environments such as having an earlier retirement age. Kuwaiti women qualify at 45 years old, and what we see is that their labor force participation rate halves. So when we want to look at Kuwait specifically and why we don't see women in some of these leadership positions, well, a lot of the women at 45 years, half the labor force goes away, half the labor force retires because they can. And so you're losing quite a bit of human capital through this policy environment that's being set up. But what's also happening is when we start talking about some of these undercurrents, right, you're getting a message that women don't need to be working, right? You get a message that it's okay for women to not be in the workforce. And not that we want to share the opposite message. We don't want to share the message that everybody must work, because, you know, different households and different people have different priorities. But we do want there to be an equal value in the work that's being done by different people. So nationalization policies also have some play here at the national level. So there are actually laws in the Gulf region that say women can't be in certain sectors, or women can't work at certain times of day, especially in Saudi, when you have the segregated workspaces that need to be available before women are allowed in the workplace. So there are different ways that the national level is going to dictate, you know, both the issues that your organization is confronting and you know, the ways in which you can go about fixing them or addressing them. But we do see, again, a lot of progress. So we don't want to get stuck on just where we are, just knowing that a lot of progress has been made in the Gulf, and even in some of the most discriminating countries in the Gulf. So for example, Saudi has been one of the most improved countries in the world in just 3 short years, since 2017. Nearly 6 of 8 indicators. So when it comes to the women in the law, so in the national policy environment, they've made progress and you know, across the board when it comes to awareness for harassment in the workplace, allowing women to be mobile and to choose where they go, you know, non-discrimination policies. So change can happen at a very quick pace. So getting into the results of the NAMA and PI study, Pearl Initiative study. So we're going to speak to, they did both a UAE edition and a Gulf region edition, and today we're going to speak to the Gulf region. So they did 5 of the Gulf countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, Oman, and Saudi. This included both a literature review, focus groups, stakeholder phone calls and interviews, and a survey. And as you'll see, the survey is a bit small, but it does give us some really interesting results. More likely to be female respondents than male. And you'll see there's country representations are a little bit variable. So the majority of the responses that we're going to be analyzing come from UAE, about 17% from Saudi, 14% from Oman, 7% from Bahrain, and you know, I think there were 6 people from Kuwait. So even if I show Kuwait in the you know, show the countries in the graphs, I just want you to understand that actually we're seeing kind of more female responses, a little bit weighted towards the UAE as far as the perspectives that are being represented here. Other things that came out when I looked closer at the respondents, the women who did respond, as we see there's mostly women, tended to be younger, single and without children, and also having fewer years work experience. So the kind of woman that responded to the survey, again, younger, single, without children, fewer years work experience, which kind of goes hand in hand with being younger. And then the men that responded tended to be more older, married with children, and more senior. So showing more years work experience in their perspectives. So just keeping that in mind as we speak through some of the results. So what we saw is industry. I mean, yes, there's quite a UAE, Oman. We had quite a representation of the energy and environment sector. But across the board, we had a fairly broad smattering of industries that responded. As I mentioned, the year's work experience, there were more women with fewer years work experience, whereas men tended to be in the senior levels on average. This also correlated to educational attainment and age and employment level. So we're seeing, again, women tending to be younger, fewer years work experience, lower education, men on the opposite of those metrics. And the main findings when we analyzed all the responses, they come into three different sectors. So there's the top 3 factors that are hindering women in the workplace are found to be unconscious bias, having children, and preconceptions of women's roles and responsibilities. The top 3 workplace processes that were seen as hindering women's progression were gendered stereotypes and perceptions, demanding work hours and conditions, so that links to kind of that organizational environment aspect that we've been talking about, and the lack of policies supporting women's advancement. So the lack of kind of those nudges to say, actually, we want to see more women, right? We want to provide an environment that's really open and inclusive. And then the third kind of group of results we want to talk about is, the top 3 reasons why women report leaving the workplace, and the lack of professional advancement opportunities came out as number 1, followed by devaluation of their work efforts, so not feeling like they were valued in their positions, and a lack of work-life balance. So again, all things we sort of touched on. They all highlight this importance of organizational culture and leadership commitment. And so those are going to be 2 of the things that we focus on, not only here, but as we move forward into the second part. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of break down each one of these three areas a little bit more. So the present state of diversity in the workplace, 79% of respondents thought that their leadership was actually trying to empower and promote women. 77% of respondents thought that men and women were afforded the same benefits. But one of the things that I want to really talk about as we move through this, analyzing this work, is the gap between the male and the female respondents. So when we look at things like my organization helps women employees achieve work-life balance, okay, 57%. If somebody from my organization saw, wow, more than half of our employees are happy with our current efforts, that might be a reason to pat yourself on the back. But when we look at that, actually, there's quite a gap of 38%. So with 83% of men actually driving that average higher, and women actually feeling not as supported in their work-life balance. When they look at my organization actively raises awareness about issues related to women's careers, again, we see a 30% gender gap. Men and women with the same credentials have the same opportunities. Again, 27% gap, with men being on this perception that things are better than women's experiences are reflecting. So this really just shows us the need to be attentive to differences between men and women, and their perception of what the issues are and how far we've come, but also understanding that when we take this kind of a perceptive gap and we map it onto areas where men are in decision-making power, that overconfidence and then the actions they're going to be decided on within those boardrooms and within those management groups are going to not necessarily be reflective of the total employee experience, right? That it may not be, the decisions and the ways that we go about changing things might not actually reflect the problems on the ground. So really ensuring that that we have the full understanding and that we are really inclusive when trying to identify and define the problems in our organization is going to be very important. And so when we break those responses down a little bit more by country, we see that, that there's, so the percentage of women that hold, let's see, I apologize, this is, okay. So my organization's work culture supports women. We see that the country by country, we have a little bit of a difference here. Kuwaitis being a little bit low, but remember that was a bit of a small sample size. But on average, there's a good amount of people that say there is a support, but not a ton, right? And as we get to the disagreeing, right, that the numbers go a little bit more. Bahrain thinks there's more that can be done. It looks like so. So we look at then the percentage of women that have senior management positions within an organization. We see that, you know, Saudi actually has quite low. The number of people who responded that had less than 5% women was, you know, more than 60%. Kuwait was the same. Oman was pretty much up there. So confirming that there is a lack of women at higher levels across the countries. Looking at this idea of kind of female-dominated departments. So are we speaking to people that did the women who responded, were they in more mixed environments or in more segregated environments? And so we see that, you know, that the women that responded were actually more likely to be segregated. So we see the, you know, the blue and the orange and the purple at the end there. So those women were more likely to work around other women, which is in some ways a response to social, organizational, and national kind of policies and ideas around what kind of work women should do. And then we see the men also being a little less, being kind of the same story, but we're seeing that in the opposite with the high scores in the green and the yellow. So again, so this just links to the idea that, especially in the GCC, that there's this trend to kind of have acceptable work sectors. But that acceptable message comes from a lot of different places. So when we look then at the factors hindering women's career progression, so after stereotype bias, women report having a lack of leadership support, which is different than men who, they agree that there's stereotypes and bias, but then the men very quickly are able to, they jump to this explanation that women don't have the technical skills, right? That it's actually women's technical skills that keep them. And if they had the right technical skills, then of course they would have equal representation in the workforce. And so we discussed that for a lot of different reasons, that's not true. But we do see the gap persisting here between the responses that men and women give. So at any gap that's, you know, 15 to 20%, which is quite high. So we see women feeling much more that they don't have the support of their organization, that, you know, there's not a clear path for them to progress through their organization. And then we see this, that there's a reversal then when you look at marriage. So men are more likely to overestimate the importance of marriage, whereas women are actually, right, they only put marriage down as something that gets in the way of their work 13% of the time. So that stereotype about women in marriage and work-life balance might not be something that's really based on reality. It might be something that's being driven by these ideas that are continuing themselves within the workplace. And so men are reporting that marriage and children get in the way of women much more than women actually report it. And so again, when we look at men being then in decision-making roles, that kind of stereotype, that bias, can have a very real impact on women's opportunities in their workplaces. So again, when we break this down by country, there are some interesting differences here. You have UAE looking at having children being a big factor that gets in the way. Whereas in, you know, Saudi Arabia, that children don't rank that highly, but lack of support within the organization does. So we look at Kuwait, and you're looking at kind of the preconceptions of women's roles and responsibilities is a little more, you know, a more common option, whereas Bahrain has the unconscious bias here. So saying that, you know, we recognize that this is happening, but we kind of don't know why. We think there's biases that are still in action. So while, you know, there are many factors, and the factors are well spread across all the countries, with the most popular ones being just a little bit different. When we look at workplace processes that hinder women's progression within the organizations, so the three that were identified in the study were the preconceptions and stereotypes, demanding work hours, and a lack of support for women's advancement. But if we dig a little bit deeper into this, we'll find that, you know, the people that feel that there's a lack of leadership commitment is actually women. And so women aren't feeling that the leadership is speaking to them and to their needs as an employee within the organization. When we get to the lack of skills and knowledge, as we mentioned earlier, men are actually really driving this opinion. And then the fact that women are being held to higher standards, we see, right, of some of the biggest gender gaps, 17% gap. So nearly a third of women feel that there's a different standard for them, whereas men are not aware, right, or men are not conscious that this standard is being communicated. Breaking this down a little bit more by men and women, right? This idea that do women have the qualifications to be engaged in the industry sector you work in? This is something that becomes very, very important in those male-dominated industries. We'll see it again in the oil sector case study in just a bit. And what we see is that women feel like they're more likely to feel like women have the qualifications. And men, you see a lot more the often and then the sometimes. So understanding that this perception of this goes back to that meritocratic element that is part of these decisions and these perceptions, is this idea of, well, everybody has the same right, and if women had the same skills, then they would easily be represented at equal levels. And so often and very quickly, especially among men, we've seen this idea that, well, women just don't have the skills becomes a reality rather than just a perception. And so then when we dig a little bit deeper into the gender, you know, the gap between men and women as to why women leave the workplace. So yes, overall, the report finds that it's, you know, professional advancement, devaluation, and a lack of work-life balance that the women are reporting. But the men then, we see that this gap happens where actually men don't really see that women are being devalued. Only 6% of men think that, you know, that women's work isn't given its proper value. You have 39% of men that say it's logistical issues. So this is where we get, again, this idea that work-life balance is a problem for women. A lot of men are just not sure. They don't know why. And that is part of the problem as well, because if you don't understand your staff and you don't understand your work environment and how it's impacting your employees, then that's that's a problem as well. And then we see here that women are twice as likely to think that there's no professional advancement opportunity, and that's not something that's going to work well for any organization. Is if your employees, you know, feel like this that opportunity to advance doesn't exist for you. So if we look country by country, why women leave, we see, you know, quite a high representation in the unsure, this bright green that's across. So really, organizations are maybe not actually really asking why women are leaving employment. We're letting kind of these stories of work-life balance color, you know, what might be the real reasons, which might be a feeling of devalued efforts, a lack of support, a lack of a clear pathway forward. So, but what we're not seeing being reported highly is, you know, necessarily childcare or this you know, family pressures and some of the things that are easy to assume. So then we look at the data to say, okay, well, what is actually facilitating women's career growth? What are the things that are having positive impacts? And we see you know, we see that on the averages, again, are hiding some really important gender gaps. So organizational culture, something I'm trying to present a very clear theme of throughout this presentation, is one of the top factors that there is no gender gap on. Men and women both value this and both know that it helps women's career growth. But the leadership commitment, we see a large gap on. Men putting that as more important than women. Now, potentially this could be as a result of our particular sample where we saw the men were more likely to be in, you know, positions of leadership. But this is also quite high. Recruitment opportunities, both men and women understand this is important. But then we see here, again, we see those trends flip where if we go down to supportive family and supportive society, you know, we have a really big gender gap. We have 10%, which, I mean, not as big as some of them, but still statistically important. That this idea of there being a full environment, so as much as the work that you can do in your organization, it's still going to be impacted by the societal and the family pressures that women feel. So just a point that came out in the data that that was important to share, but really what this data is showing is top-down approaches are really supported by this research as being an acceptable way to kind of move forward on making these changes. And so then when we looked at the women themselves, 49% of women reported that they had some kind of personal obstacle. So when we try to reduce the number of those unsures, right? If you get the next Pearl Initiative survey, we want you to be a little more aware of why women could be leaving. So so we just broke this down a little bit more. You know, and yes, sacrificing other aspects of work is a part of it, but you know, taking a career break is going to impact my career plans. It's difficult to move locations because women are more likely to be in dual income earner households because it's more socially acceptable for men to work. Men are expected to work. But whereas men could work in a house where women don't, it would be easier for them to move then. Women would almost by definition be working in a house where men are working. And so relocation might be less accessible to them. Again, the cultural view of, you know, my husband's career would take precedence over my own aspirations. So there's a certain amount of social element there. And so, yeah, so how much of this is facts that I don't have enough experience, right? We had 17% up there, or I don't feel confident. And how much of it is kind of this messaging that we have, that we've written around the idea of women in the workplace. That's not something we can discern from this data, but it's important just to keep in mind. So what the study does show us is that, you know, that there's really strong support for this top-down, you know, really management-heavy, management-led organizational changes. And the key to that is going to be that there are multiple levels and really just a mindset of this is going to happen, right? We're not going to let you back away from it. We are going to institute these changes. That helps us to see impact in the long run, creating an organizational culture. So it's not just about gender positive discrimination towards women. It's about creating a culture that's actually much more attuned to foster the work of individuals. And yes, gender equitable policies are one of those, but there are many, many others in the mix. And then when and where you do have female employees, you know, support systems, ensuring that they see that path forward, that they are allowed to cultivate that ambition within your organization is going to help to retain them and to then get the value out of them. So, so yeah. So what what Pearl Initiative went and did as far as putting these findings into action was they created this enable, foster, and entrench framework that we are going to look at in the second half. So, so that is the first half of the presentation. I welcome any questions or comments if there's anything kind of hanging from everything that we covered. I know it was a lot of data. I'm trying to kind of plant seeds and to give you a really well-rounded framework to kind of absorb all this information. So I'm happy to hear any kind of feedback that you might be able to give, or questions, or shared experiences.
Hi, as before, if you've got any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute you so you can speak directly. Or you can send a question in the questions tab and I'd be happy to read that out so it gets answered.
So we designed this to be a lot more conversational because, I mean, these are elements that impact everybody. So we're trying to continue that on this online forum. So I do hope you'll share. Okay. So am I to assume that everything, there's no questions, there's no comments to the results, those of you in the Gulf, that there's a reaction to the findings that came? Does that mean you're ready? You're just ready for me to keep talking? Shruti, no questions coming through?
None at present.
Okay. All right, well then I guess we'll keep moving along. And again, if anything does come up, please feel free to contribute. So in this second half, we're going to look at, as I foreshadowed, a little bit of a focus on the oil industry, oil and energy industries. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into those recommendations in that enable, foster, and entrench framework. And then we'll talk a little bit about unconscious bias with some examples, and then there's a bunch of case studies at the end of the presentation that I don't know that we're going to go over in this format, but that would certainly be available to you to see other companies, how they identified goals and then how they went about achieving them. So just to kind of get us back into the moment, so we have this moment for thought that when a woman's name is replaced with a man's name on a resume, and this is not new, but it's always enlightening, how much more likely were evaluators to say they would hire the applicant? And I think I have, did I do this in a poll? I did. Let's see. Okay. So let's just see those of you that have, just in case you're not aware of this research. CVs were sent out, and the only thing different was the name, but all the other qualifications were the same. Okay, looks like you guys have slowed down. I'll give it about 10 seconds if you haven't voted and you want to. All right, and I'm just about to shut it down. Any last answers? Speak now. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close that poll. So we had a little bit of a diversity in this one. 11% said over 30% more likely, 28% said over 48% more likely, 22 said over 50%, and then 39% of y'all said over 60% more likely, which is the answer that was found in the research. And so this is just one of those things that, again, when we look to say, and especially against this idea that women don't have the same skills as men, right? So even in this resume experience, we're showing that it's actually not necessarily the skills that are the problem, right? That are at the issue. So diving into the energy sector, did we get any questions, Shruti, before I jump into?
None at the moment.
Okay, great. So we're going to power on through then. So there are fewer women in oil and gas than in almost any other major industry, which probably isn't a surprise for most of the people here. But we do see some regional variation as an industry. So globally, you've got about 15% of women in senior management. This is very heavily kind of promoted by the North American and European areas, and less so in the Middle East and Asia and the Pacific. And so people are saying, which we talked about a bit, is that there's a pipeline issue, that there's just not enough women. The women are only 27% of entry-level positions, whereas when we talked about the broken rung, we had more of an equal distribution. And that it looks like there's not so much change until we get to really the senior executive levels and then CEOs. When we look in like subfields, when we look really across the diversity of oil and energy organizations that exist, we see some of the green energy, solar energy in particular, being more diverse than some of the just the crude extraction companies. So there is again going to be diversity within those numbers, but there are studies that show that there is a really crucial benefit to female inclusion in the oil and gas, the oil and energy sectors in particular. One of the primary reasons of which being the increased workforce and then retention of talent. So the extractive industries are largely facing a labor deficit in the coming years. The aging workforce is, the workforce is aging, and there's going to be a labor shortage in the coming years that's estimated at nearly 30,000 jobs every year in a time that has been existing for the previous 5 years, but they think there's another 15 years to go in this particular issue. So this is combined with the cyclical nature of extractives, right? Right now with the coronavirus, the oil price is quite low. And so there's probably, we're probably looking at another, 2016 where there was a layoff across the industry. But this kind of hiring in the boom times and laying off in the bust times can make it much harder to replace employees and to retain them, to replace them, to get qualified employees into leadership positions. So when we're dealing with this industry, we just need to keep that cyclical hiring practice in mind. However, women are going to be important to meet those labor needs in the coming years. But what we see for women in the extractives is when they're there, they have some really positive really positive impacts. So women operating machinery, they tend to need less maintenance work, right? They care for their machines in a way that the maintenance costs are lower. Women tend to make colleagues more accountable, so the safer work culture that is nurtured with a more diverse workforce in the oil and the extractives has been found with data and shown in the research. And then we also have the bottom line. So we have this idea that even in the oil industry, for every British pound that's invested in a mining or extractive business, you have the board members. Those with all male boards, on average, will lose 2%, and those with 2 or more women return 6%. So this speaks to a lot of the points that we brought up, beforehand. Also, I think it was Salwa, but I could be wrong. That this idea of 2 or more women, that when we get by just the one woman, we're not seeing these returns with one woman, we're seeing them with 2 and more. So really ensuring that gender representation is meaningful is important to seeing these kinds of returns that we're associating with women at the board level. And so in this industry audit, which was done by Price Waterhouse, there were very specific recommendations for gender diversity within this industry, and so the advice for the companies was, having a regular gender audit that looks at gender equality within all the elements of the organization, setting and maintaining challenging but achievable goals. So being aggressive with where you want to go as a company, but making sure that it's, the bites are achievable. And then, looking at retention, recruitment, promotion, evaluation, remuneration. So really doing a deep dive into each of these elements of the organization for anything that could be supporting a gendered workforce, a gender discriminatory workforce. Is important. And then when you do have those senior leaders, having them be role models, and it's one of the things we're going to talk about moving forward, but both men and women can do this role model, can fill this role model role, but it is important that there be role models. It helps to address some of the issues that came up in the Pearl Initiative research results when they were looking at, not having a clear path forward. So role modeling definitely helps to associate that.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there's a question. Do you like? I can read it out.
Sure.
Sarvanan asks, is there a case showing increase in employee productivity or profitability by increasing the percentage of women in a company, either at top and middle management?
I'm sure that there are many, many case studies. And hopefully I invite you to take a look at the ones at the end, just because it's not in my brain right now. I'm more of a paper person. I like to go through my research. But I'm sure that there are studies out there. So I know that, so you're looking at, tell me the question again. It was women in senior roles and increased.
Yeah, is there a case showing increase in employee productivity or profitability by increasing the percentage of women in a company in the top and middle management?
Yeah, so we did definitely go through the profitability part in the beginning. So I'll invite you to go to the earlier slides where we covered both profitability and value creation as women's representation changed in an organization. So that is definitely in this presentation. I'm not sure what kind of employee productivity results are out there, because I would assume that productivity is a very organization specific definition. So I'm not sure. I think that would be difficult to find in the research, because I think you'd want to look at what exactly about productivity you're actually wanting to capture. But I will certainly try to keep that in mind as we move forward and highlight anything that comes up to that question. Okay, so we're going back to the Pearl Initiative results. And so when we're looking at the recommended policy packages that we're considering at an organizational level, there are different levels of support in the government and in the Gulf region for different kinds of policies. And among the policies that see the highest support are, again, these top down, so company culture and company policies. So this very top down, the company should define the kind of workplace that is there. Leadership commitment comes third. So we see this very clear message. But one of the things that I want to just point out here is that we need to be very careful when it comes to creating those policies, right, from the top down. And one of the examples that we have is from Amazon, who in 2014, they tried to get rid of bias in their hiring because they used this computer program rather than a person to vet the resumes for people coming in, right? And they said, okay, well, if we let the computer do it, then it won't have the bias that a person would have. And actually, what they found was that by virtue of the fact that historically most of Amazon's employees had been men, the information when they built the computer program was actually very biased towards men. And so what happened was the computer program actually, it continued that bias rather than eradicated it. And so when we talk about kind of organizational and business leadership towards creating inclusive environments, this is just a very telling cautionary tale as to how sometimes these policies may not get you the impact that you're wanting. And so one of the ways, what had happened was the language, the gender difference in the language in the resumes was being picked up by the computer program. So they would value that assertive language more, which was more likely to be male. And so there were different small ways, some of these little things that we've spoken about that actually even the computer program learned. So knowing that these policies, there's no easy fix, and they're going to take a lot of really focused attention to build a really appropriate policy environment. So with regards to the Gulf country responses to the study, we see that there are some differences in the kinds of policies that the countries, the workers are more or less in favor of. So we see this, again, kind of that leadership commitment is really, really strongly supported in Bahrain. Unbiased company policies, again, Bahrain, but almost twice the rate of Kuwait and Oman. Training and development of women becomes very, very popular. So this again builds into this idea that women don't have the right skills. Now there's the difference between technical qualifications and then as our participant was telling us, right, the actual kind of the soft skills and the leadership skills being a different kind of qualification. So I don't think that was specified in this question, but I think for our own purposes, we should just be careful to separate that there's a certain thing that the meritocratic idea that men and women in the same position should have the same skills, but also understanding that women in some ways will need potentially mentorship or again, as our participant pointed out, something to help them feel, and potentially your male employees would benefit from a kind of leadership training to help them feel ready to take the next step up into the leadership position. So again, this wouldn't have to be a program that was only for women, but by virtue of addressing some of that soft skill development, then it could end up leading to more equitable outcomes for the female employees. And then looking at, so there's when this comes to linking diversity to performance is where we start getting less support, right? This idea that I want one of my KPIs to be how diverse my team is. I think part of the reason we see a lot lower support for this kind of a policy is because people don't really know what to do, right? And it feels like they would then be held responsible for something that that we're not quite clear on, or they might feel like they'd have to make decisions that they're not really prepared to make, or they don't quite understand. And so me personally, looking at these results, that's what I see. I see the idea of actually holding managers accountable can be a very interesting, it can be a very overwhelming suggestion, again, when there's not a full kind of that full top-down backing of the senior management and of the different parts of the organization. So and then as we start getting into other elements like quotas and diversity training, flexibility, we see that the countries, there are some strong differences, but some that aren't so strong. So maternity leave seems to be more important in the UAE than in Kuwait or Saudi. Mentorship doesn't appear as highly as some of the other ones, but I think we'll have a chance to talk about that. Is there anything in these findings that anyone has a question on before we just take that more into application? Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so. Okay, we'll just move on. So if we're going to take, so if we take Pearl Initiative's analysis of their findings into this enable, foster, entrench, what does that actually mean? So the enable part of this element is really finding the elements that can be addressed by policy in your workplace that can have impact on diversity and inclusion. And what the research shows us is that the factors that really can enable this that are policies like flexible work hours, paid family leave, maternity and paternity, and then critical mass, which is also kind of quota, which we'll speak of towards the end. So when it comes to flexible work policies, as I've mentioned previously, right, it's really not just women that are driving this, it's men and women. And so even just changing the way that we talk about these work policies as either flexible work or as family leave or as work-life balance programs rather than maternity or childcare, right? The ways in which these policies can be framed so that what we might be saying employees, but people are picturing women, right? We're trying to diminish that impact. And so men and women actually are finding current rates of the current expectations of work to be at odds with their ability to balance work and life, whatever that means for an individual. So, so what we have is there's one study done in Canada in law firms. So it's one very specific study, but they found that every time the employee left, right, law firms can be quite intense work environments, but every time an employee left, the cost to the firm was equal to 2 years' salary for that employee. So if we think of that cost as 2 years' salary, there's quite a lot of flexibility that you could give to an employee before you undergo the organizational cost of 2 years' salary to replace them, right? And so we do see that this flexibility is becoming normalized. In 2019, 70% of employees had some kind of flexibility at work compared to 40% in 2015. So I do think we're seeing a cultural shift here in how people are balancing. I think part of the reason why we're doing that is that we have this increased need for 2 incomes in a household. So it is more important that families can figure out their life with 2 income earners. And so, yeah, so again, I think that we're seeing that some of the traditional ways of doing things no longer fit kind of that new normal that we have now. And that's feeding some of this friction. So one of the really important components to that is to talk about family leave rather than just maternity or even paternity. So more than 1 in 4 employees were found to say that it hurt their career or finances to take family leave. So women are reporting this especially, but even men. So as we have more companies offering paternity leave or just basic family leave, which is something that that is not just biased towards children, but also if you have an elderly, a family member who's sick or a parent who needs care, you could take the leave to take care of that as well. But women are being reported, women are reporting negative consequences more than men. And then increased paternity leave is showing that this trend is reversing a little bit, because again, no longer are women carrying all of this weight and all of, kind of the ire of their coworkers because of this it's only maternity leave that they're thinking of, right? By increasing this to where it's a leave that is men and women can take, we're reducing some of the focus towards women. And actually men in 2019 were more likely or nearly equally as likely to take leave of some extent, right? The lengths of these leaves depend generally on the organization. Although a few countries have instituted it as well, mainly in the Western Europe and Western and Northern European countries. So just to kind of play this around in our minds, so if a colleague tells you, we had kind of talked about this earlier, that a colleague finds that they're frustrated that a woman's taking full maternity leave during a busy time for the company. So why does this happen? I think we did this one. Did we do this one? Did it get repeated? Shruti, is this one repeating itself? I think
it's very similar to the one that we did earlier.
Okay, all right, so here, I've got another one, so we'll just skip this one. You overhear colleagues say, it would be great to hire more women, but I worry about lowering our bar. So has this happened to you? Why does it happen? What can we do about it? Any contributions? No hands? Okay. Okay, so if you hear things like this in the workplace, generally we're reflecting assumptions that that the bar isn't the same. So any kind of policy that that reinforces these assumptions is going to help keep this kind of a mentality living and active. And so research actually shows that the bar is unfair, but actually it's unfair in the other way, that as has been brought up by some of our participants, that performance expectations for women are higher. In the Gulf, we also have the wasta culture. So then the bar isn't necessarily skills-based, but connections-based, which is shown to, women are at a disadvantage in terms of networks in the Gulf, but also in general. And then this goes back to that earlier question as well about meritocracy. So this idea that, again, if everybody had the same qualifications, we wouldn't have an issue with diversity. And that it's by virtue of lower qualifications of certain kinds of people why they're not in higher positions, which hopefully this presentation, if that was your view before this workshop, hopefully you're starting to learn that that's not it's not the whole story. And so again, one of the ways that we can address, if this is something that happens in your organization, where people, you get an idea that your employees feel they've got a conflict about certain kinds of proactive hiring policies, standardization and transparency tend to be policies that are very effective against this kind of an idea. And so when employees are very secure with why people are being hired, what the criteria are for promotions, right? When this is a very clear and transparent and well understood process, we see a lot less of these kinds of biases, because people don't have to fill in their own explanation. They have a very clear explanation from their organization. So those are the factors that help to enable, right, some of the policy space that's available within an organization. So now when we really, though, want to foster, we want to build women's engagement in the workforce, we have this idea of more holistic policy approaches, right? Something like a family leave policy is a very, that's a very targeted approach, but we want to build ultimately much more holistic policies and much more advanced and inclusive work environments. Again, stressing this idea that the tone from the top is very important. And then mentorship, this links to kind of mentorship and or sponsorship programs. So having either the leadership individuals that will do this, or having a program in place to address some of these ideas of women's lower self-promotion. There's another one called intentional invisibility, and this kind of speaks to that backlash element that we were talking about, where you have kind of this set of strategies that women have to kind of keep the focus off of them. So there's a bunch of research that's been done. You can Google it on intentional invisibility and how women actually minimize there's a reason in their environments to minimize their accomplishments. And this is built into lower self-promotion, but it also has to do with households, women not being able to, or it not being acceptable for women to outshine their husbands. They don't want to outshine maybe their managers. So we get this idea that to reduce conflict, to feel authentic, to feel part of a team, to feel like, well, I'm just doing my job, rather than if I put myself forward, then I'm not just doing my job, right? I want to just kind of be a part of the team, and then balancing that work and family role the way that women do. We see this trend towards intentional invisibility, and a large part of both of those is due to the backlash that is often provided not just in the workplace but in the home, if women are seen as kind of stepping outside of those elements. And so when we look at these elements to foster women, there are different, understanding where the issues are in your organization becomes really clear, becomes really important. So if you feel like you have issues at the recruitment phase, or the retention phase, or the advancement phase, is going to alter slightly the kinds of policies that you would want to pursue to address each of those issues. So, if it's the recruitment phase, you might be looking, for more diverse applications. We understand that even the way that a job is worded in a job advertisement can give women subtle clues that this job is or isn't for you. Again, we talked about women's, when women are only going to apply to a job that they have 100% of the qualifications for versus a man. And then this idea of blind screening, and this is something that comes up. I mean, the need for it is shown by the example we had with the resumes, with the names changed and having the female name be 60% less likely to be called. But one of the shifts we started to see especially in the arts and the like music and symphonies, in the 70s, I believe, was this thing of blind screening. And so just having the musician play behind a screen so that the people didn't know if it was a male or a female, they were only being judged on their musical ability. We saw like a 75% increase in representation of women across the Philharmonic organizations because of this recruitment practice. So there are a lot of organizations that will filter out names before hiring managers are shown applications. So there are ways of doing that. That can be effective if that is what you're looking to achieve. Moving to networking and support groups, retention. So networking and support groups for women to kind of help keep them there, building up this flexible work environment, right? These would help you with retention. And then advancement, again, becomes a really, if advancing women up the pipeline is really what you're trying to achieve, then really having visible role models, having mentoring and coaching. So having a way to create that vision, to have that ambition to say, wow, there's a place for me at this organization all the way to the top, right? For as far as I want to take it. That's a really powerful message to give to your employees. And we've actually, one of the cautions that I like to give at this point is that this idea of unconscious bias, it's been really popular, and there's been a whole lot of money. They think like $1 billion has been spent around the world on unconscious bias training. And yeah, there is some value to being aware, right? I'm all for awareness, and hopefully this workshop has planted a few seeds as far as how to interpret things and how to explain things to yourself and how we understand these issues. But what we've also seen is we've seen a backlash against that bias training. And what we found is that sometimes when we emphasize bias, when we say, wow, everybody's biased, it reduces our ability or our imperative to do anything about it. And so it's almost as if we're saying that, well, everybody is biased. So there's not, I don't really need to do anything about it because, we're all just biased anyway. And that's not necessarily the most productive message that we want coming out of these kinds of discussions. And so one of the ways that that this has been actually shown in the research is there was a bunch of recruiters, and they were told either that stereotypes are common or stereotypes are rare. And when the recruiters were told that stereotypes were common, right, that a lot of people have stereotypes, the recruiters were actually 28% less likely to have interest in hiring a female candidate. And the female candidates that they interviewed, they were rated 27% less likable than the men. Whereas on the other side, if the recruiters were told the other way, you didn't see that stereotypes are rare. If you sort of just planted that information in their brain, they were less likely to show bias in any form. So that's kind of an interesting result in terms of the way that we operate as individuals. And again, what we're doing is we're propagating this idea that if everybody is biased, then you don't need to do anything different. And that's not necessarily the idea that we want to share. And actually a very tiny kind of reworking of that idea helps us to see very different results. And what the researchers then did in an additional study was they actually told people that the vast majority of people were able to overcome bias, right? That, okay, we have bias, but we can overcome it. And just by making that small shift in the way that just planting that seed in the recruiters' minds, we actually see the bias shift. And women were 28% more likely to be interested, for the recruiters were interested in them, and then they were judged more likable as well. So so this is something that can happen in the recruitment phase, but it's also something that's been shown to help in the kind of the retention and advancement phase. So also not just nudging recruiters, but nudging the women themselves to say, wow, this is something I can do. So there was research with US students in business school, and even in the business school, they were having issues getting these young women to take leadership positions. And so the first way they tried to address this was by saying, well, we as the management, right, we as the leaders are going to come out and say, well, we want more women, right? So like more women need to apply. And actually they saw that this didn't change any of the women were not more likely to come forward with that kind of a message. But the next year, when they asked for people to nominate themselves for leadership positions, they added the statement, we don't ever want to see the low representation that we've been having again. And just by adding that little extra emphasis of, this is actually not an outcome that we condone, it's an outcome that we want to change. There was a 65% increase in the women who self-promoted, right? These young women that self-promoted to take on those leadership roles. So very, very, very small things can actually have a very big impact, which is sort of the basis of this nudge mentality. But particularly when it comes with creating these environments, there can be, the research is showing that there's some very large impacts to be had. And so when we're looking at some of the country differences, so one of the things you want to do is be aware of where in that recruitment, retention, advancement frame you really want to focus your efforts as an organization. Something else would be looking at your country environment. So what kind of guidance do you have from the national policies that you can use to base some of your strategies? What are some of the more popular policy strategies, or what's needed in your organization? We had a little bit of difference by country, but really kind of that organizational culture and the leadership support came out really heavily. So it seems like in the Gulf that very top-driven approach is not only something that's going to be effective, but it's something that will be welcomed by the employees. And it ends up being very, very important to have that top-down support, regardless of the full kind of policy package that you create as an organization. So having not only top-down support, but top-down support from men. I mean, it makes a difference. So not only are men more likely to be in these positions, but when these powerful men make comments about the changes that need to happen, it's more likely to come to have an impact in the lived experience of the employees. So what this research shows that created this this graph that you're seeing is that actually senior leaders are more likely to challenge behavior. So if they see gender biased behavior, if they see stereotypes, senior leaders are more likely to challenge that regardless of whether they're male or female. Now it just so happens that they are more likely to be male, but really once you have a position of seniority, the cost to you to challenge these behaviors that you see or operations that are not acceptable, you really just have more space to do that than people at the entry level. So really supporting the senior leadership to be very clearly vocal about what's acceptable and what isn't is a very powerful strategy for addressing the organizational culture. And what we see is, yes, on all, but what the research shows is that in all levels of employment, women are more likely to speak out. Women are more likely to observe behavior, but men are more likely to speak out. And so we see this gender gap in that, in the acceptability of speaking up, right? And so we see, especially even for women at senior leadership, we've kind of covered through this workshop that there are many things that they may have dealt with to get there, and there is a very real likelihood of there being a backlash against women who do speak out. So at the moment, right, what this research shows is men are more likely to speak out when they see something, but they're less likely to see it. So what we're looking for is ideally we would support a workplace where everybody's aware of what kind of biased behavior looks like, right? What biased behavior is, and everybody's able to speak out when they see it. But what we see is that feeling of comfort, that feeling of being secure in your work environment differs by gender. And it has an impact then on replicating, allowing biased behavior to continue throughout the organization. So, but what should also be a takeaway from this is the fact that men have a very important role to play. And this goes back to one of the earlier questions on should it be men or women or men and women together. But if we could get the men to be recognizing what biased behavior is a little more often and maintaining their likelihood to speak out, we could be seeing real changes just that simply. And this is research that was, this was 329 companies and nearly 70,000 employees. So this was quite a broad stroke of research here that's represented. So not just one organization. So bringing some of these, trying to positioning ourselves at the intersection of a few things we're talking about. In this prompt, you realize that a colleague who's a man is only mentoring other men. So obviously in the Gulf, this is a really pertinent example, but we just saw how important men can be for promoting different work cultures. So why does this happen, and what can we do about it? And have you experienced this? Hopefully we can share some personal experiences. I welcome you to raise your hand. I would welcome hearing a new voice. No takers? Shruti, do you see anybody that I'm missing?
No, I also invite everyone to raise their hands or submit a question. If we get a couple of questions, then we can have a spirited debate on this front. I mean, if I can add my 2 cents in here.
Sure.
I've seen this happen, and the thing is that I've seen this happen not just because of unconscious biases, but also because there are more men than women in the organizations that I've seen this happen at. And then this circles back to the hiring, the company culture, and other things that I think, collectively contribute to an exclusionary experience for women employees.
Of course. And I've heard of this happening because men are trying to be sensitive to women, because I don't want to make a female feel uncomfortable. I don't want to put her in a position. And so sometimes you have this outcome, but the reason for it is actually very different, right? It can be coming from a very different place. No other comments? Okay. Then we'll move it down. And so part of this is this idea that we're drawn to people like ourselves. But again, this fear of being inappropriate, which I think in the golf context is especially applicable. Nearly 50% of men in management are uncomfortable participating in work with the women. And I think that sometimes it's just, I guess we just don't know how, right? And in some spaces, especially these male-dominated work environments, that kind of comfort level, that understanding of how this is going to go isn't quite there. And so that nervousness can really impact people. And so ways that we can address this, right? You have a discussion. You tell them why mentoring is really valuable. You can even recommend, this is where kind of that idea of coming up with a really complete candidate list. So if you know someone or you yourself is thinking about taking on a mentee, make a specific effort to think about men and women, or maybe have a pair, right? So then you get rid of some of that one-on-one element. But there are just different ways. These are just things to be aware of, because some of these small behaviors can actually can propagate the gendered issues, even if you have other policies that are against them. I'm going to keep giving you guys examples. So if we were in a room together, I'd be able to give you individual stares. You're protected from that right now, but in this one, you say, okay, you're in a meeting and it's the client that's only looking at or speaking to the men on your team. So why would this happen, and what can you do in this situation? I know that I hear that a lot from the female entrepreneurs that I speak to, and is sometimes they're sending in their own interns, even though they're the business owner. But somebody will only want to speak to a man, and this can be a really important barrier to women in the workplace in the region. So I see a question, Shruti, about being a mentor. Do you see this one? In some organizations, being a mentor or coach forms part of the non-financial KPIs. Do you feel this is a good approach? I think mentorship is a really undervalued process in our corporate culture, right? As kind of this North American, European individual idea of work has grown in kind of our post-industrial and then technological economies. I think that element of mentorship, there used to be these apprenticeships, and it was very much expected that somebody would really show you how to do your job. And now we've even with the gig economy, right, you're sort of expected to show up knowing everything, and even if you don't, it can be very hard to catch up. So I do think that being a mentor is something that's really critical to creating an inclusive and a successful organizational space. When somebody was talking about judging things in terms of employee productivity, I definitely think that is important. Mentorship is a really important part of that process. As far as it being a KPI, there's a lot of different ways that it can be done, and it can be tracked, right? The way that it's being measured could be different. So I think in the right environment and the right KPI system, that yes, it can be a very, very beneficial thing, but also to the same extent, just going back to your work and saying, okay, everybody now has to have a mentee, without also ensuring that you've got quality mentors, that you've created a space for that within the organization. this is not just something that's being added on top of different work, that it's just a different reflection of the role that you're wanting people to perform in your company, right? So again, taking it not just as mentorship for mentorship, but mentorship in kind of a really holistic view of how are you really going to engage this program within your organization becomes important to it being effective. So the idea of it being something that's monitored by a KPI is because you want people to do it, but you want them to do it because you think it will be effective. And so I think you have to figure out within your workforce the best way to balance those and to make sure that the program is as effective as possible. So I hope that answered your question. Is there anyone else? Shruti, do you have any others?
No, not at present.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know if I'm the only one that can see them or if you can see them. So, okay. So if we just try to break down this one with the client, you know, so this bias happening outside and not within your workforce. Again, because we live in biased cultures and communities, so there can be bias on the part of the client, you know, that the women are less competent or lower status. And so, you know, in this environment, so part of your work environment is that if something like this happens, you know, the women feel like they're part of your team, right? That's not okay. That kind of behavior isn't acceptable by your, you know, her management or her coworkers. And so, you know, trying to make sure that the women are brought into the communication, right? Maybe making sure they can speak for themselves, maybe even highlighting, right, where actually this person was the one that's really our in-house expert on that, so I'm going to let her speak, right? And so just finding a way to pass on that message that that these are people that exist and these are people that are valuable in our team and the services we provide. Not only does it impact the client, but it's going to have quite an impact on the feelings of support that the employees have. And we're talking about women, but I think that in creating a more inclusive working environment, even if you're supporting the women on the team, everybody on the team is going to get that message of, wow, this is a place where we're really, right, where they are investing in, they care about us as employees. And so, so even if they're not women, you know, that message still gets pushed forward. So this takes us to kind of that final part of the enable, foster, and entrench framework that NAMA has used to analyze and to enact their research study. And so how do we entrench women's workforce engagement? And so this is really where it becomes outside of the organization. So as an organization, then you're looking to change industry stereotypes. You want to address bias in either national policies or the communities. You know, you really start collecting data and becoming a really diverse organization. And then, you know, this in line is going to help shift your organizational composition. And different tools are available to do this, to really entrench. So instead of just a stopgap policy, you're really embracing diversity and inclusion within your entire operational model. And so gender audits, we talked about a little bit before, and gender budgeting are two different analytical tools that are really useful. Ways to break the bias cycle, especially in recruitment and promotion and mentoring, right? These different policies that we've looked at, but now, you know, we're looking at ways in which you can highlight those outcomes and those impacts in your organization to either industry, other companies, or within the industry. And then again, we'll talk a little bit more about the unconscious bias training, but we've already had a little bit of an aside on that today. So this is a really cool graph. This was created, or a pictograph. It was created by Catalyst, and it's looking at your HR system. And so really looking at the cycle of bias in your HR system. So just points that you can take with you as far as the areas that you can use, the levels that you can use to look for gender bias, and then the potential role for different people at different levels to address it. So here again, senior leaders are really important for setting the tone, and the organizational culture for the workers. HR people are really looking to then say, okay, well, if this is what we want, how are we going to do it? So HR people are really looking for tools that are going to help through the recruitment, retention, advancement process. And then again, you have employees and managers that are actually using and evaluating and enacting these policies. So this can just be a really useful way to break down your organization and just say, okay, what can we be doing with senior leaders? What can we be doing in the HR department? What do we do then with managers? How do we make sure they understand what we're going for? And then all employees just by expanding these changes to all the employees. So we've talked a bit about unconscious bias. If you define it, and this is the International Labor Organization, it's unintentional or automatic mental associations that are based on gender, and that stem from transitions, norms, values, culture, or experiences, right? So hopefully throughout this discussion, you've gotten a few seeds, right? I like to say seeds that you can plant and kind of take with you around the ways in which stereotypes, biases, expectations, stories, explanations, judgments might be automatic and might propagate values that you're not necessarily interested in sharing throughout your organization. And then understanding that men and women both do this. And it's not necessarily something we do because we need to do it. It just happens. It's part of our worldview. The world of 50 years ago was very different than the world of today. And now we have these ideas in our head that, oh, well, we should have this diversity and inclusion. But again, what that means on the ground is not always easy to translate. And I worked with the Department of Peacekeeping at the UN, and it was, they have all these great resolutions around gender equality, and these people in peacekeeping missions, right? They're saying, well, what does that mean? These peacekeeping forces are generally police and military and very, very masculine organizational ideas and hierarchical structures. And they said, okay, we've got this policy now, but I don't actually know what to do with my people to actually make it happen, right? To be in agreement with this policy. And that's, I think that's something that's being experienced in a lot of places. So understanding that, that we're all trying to figure out kind of what this looks like on the ground, I think is really important to look at. So I was going to, so in the in-person group presentation of this, we would have like the different tables kind of sit and talk about the different ways in which women's low self-promotion kind of intersects with the different forms of bias against women. So we know that the research shows women are less likely to self-promote. They provide less favorable assessments, even when they've performed equally well or better. And that employers just, we don't listen to something and say, oh, well, this woman's probably 30% more capable than she's letting on, right? Whereas the research shows that she probably is. So what are the different elements that might be, why is this happening? And I promise we're almost done, so I really hope that you will contribute and share your experiences, because it's so valuable to hear the real life experiences.
If anyone's got anything that they'd like to add, again, sorry, you can send through the questions. Don't be shy. I can also omit your name if that's something you'd like. I think, Dr. Langworthy, what advice would you give to somebody who knows that they're actively not promoting themselves? And I'm speaking about women who are aware that they're partaking in this kind of internalized thinking, but they want to rise above that. What would you say to them?
So I think that that's a little bit tricky. I don't think there's any easy way to, there's no one size fits all advice to that. I mean, you can't just go there. There's as we've covered, there's reasons why, and there's very important learned reasons why women, you know, they react this way. So I think just going to them and say, hey, self-promote, it doesn't address any of the reasons why they were choosing that behavior in the first place. And I think that the example about the nudging, right, saying we actually really want women, we really value, we want, it's not okay with us that that we're not getting women promoting themselves. I think that is a very important, I think that's a very important finding. And I think the fact that something that small can have such a huge impact shows that actually, I don't think the self-promotion is going to be a major issue once we address other organizational, the organizational elements that make women feel uncomfortable to move forward. And so I think if I had to say anything to women, it would be, what really is drive? Is it just a habit that you just don't do it because you never have? As personally, is there a reason why you're scared? Have you seen people that, you know, that there is backlash against them if they speak forward? So I think that I would really just ask women to take a really hard look, to potentially to understand what it is that's keeping them from promoting within their own experience and environment, and then look at potentially identifying a step to help. So is there a mentor you can talk to? Is there a manager you can talk to? You know, what is it just the fact that you've never seen a woman do it, and so it's not really something you consider doing? You know, in which case just trying to do it might be the right advice. In many cases, that's not going to be the right advice. So I think that's kind of how I would approach it and encourage people to approach it. It's hard to do. We all, again, this is not something that's a person by person thing. It is individual, but it's supported by so many structures, right? Organizational, societal, households, right? Maybe your mother was the one that you know said if you did that nobody would ever like you, and so I think we really just need to understand kind of where the hesitancy comes from, and that can help us to figure out how to break that cycle. So, okay. So I think all I have left for y'all is a couple of case studies.
I think we do have a hand up. Kifa's got her hand up. I'm Perfect. Just gonna unmute you, Kifa, so that you can speak. Hi, Kifa.
Yes, hi. I just wrote on my comments. Sorry about the spelling. I was writing really fast. I believe that when it comes to women's promoting themselves, it should come as well from changing the corporate culture, let's say policies and guidelines, because I know lots of women's leaders, maybe they don't have the courage or the enough experience to promote themselves on different platforms or within their senior management roles. So I think maybe like the big companies need to adopt some corporate culture guidelines and maybe policies in-house that they can encourage all of these like let's we say senior managers as a woman, to give them the tools to promote themselves. This is what I just wanted to add. Thank you.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And I think in putting it within the working culture is, as you said, you hit the nail on the head, because even if you created groups, right, to help take your women employees and give them skills to self-promote, if their male colleagues still viewed that, or their managers still viewed that as aggressive or unlikable, or, you know, if there was still a backlash to be had, then all of that training is not necessarily going to build the outcomes that you want. So yeah, I think you're right that it really has to be this inclusive. So it's why I've spent so much time today really just talking around organizational culture, that when the culture is supporting these things, then we start seeing more impact, because you know that sometimes those piece by piece solutions are not actually changing culture or changing those ideas that are the ultimate issue at hand. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Anybody else? All right, Shruti, did you want me to go through these, or should we conclude? You had mentioned earlier.
I think we can go through one and then we can conclude.
We'll go through one. Okay. So let me see here. So let's look at. So let's see. So I have this example, MetLife. So what I've done with these case studies is I've provided, there's about half a dozen, and there's different objectives, and then what they've done to meet their objectives. So if your objective is to fuel your pipeline, you know, then this is something that can be done. One of the things that was brought up earlier was increasing women, engaging women as consumers. So wanting to have women in the workplace by virtue of that economic outcome. So so I'll guess we can just, let's see. So anyway, that's how these are organized. And I guess I'll go with Zain just because it's regional as far as the company to talk about. And what Zain did is they came at their diversity and inclusion objectives by saying by on the one hand making a commitment to having 25% female representation in leadership by this year actually, and also tackling workplace gender diversity. So they wanted to kind of have this two-pronged approach where yes, we do want those numbers to some extent, but we also want to address the elements of our work culture that might be impacting the lack of women at the top. And so the way that they decided to go about this was they established a team of women ambassadors. So they made, you know, some very visible mentors available. They started collecting data. So across HR policy, leadership development, culture, recruitment. So they really took that gender audit across their organization. Incorporated women's empowerment into the CEO scorecards. So there was very much a very high level and top driven commitment to these outcomes. And then they made very specific action plans for each element of the program that they were driving forward. And so what they found was that the results, they were able to increase female recruitment by 88%. They increased female promotion by 18%, and they increased females in leadership by 7% at the director level and above. So this very clear and targeted action, even in the Gulf, has led to you know, very, very visible and very quick results for the Zain company in Kuwait. So so to finish, I wanted to really just have you think, you know, as we've been talking, what has been the most kind of pressing challenge that you see in your own organization or firm? What kind of challenge, and can you kind of create an objective to address it? So in this conversation, we've sort of been addressing that one size fits all doesn't really exist, but really understanding your context can help you to determine which issues / objectives might be a good starting place. So has anyone had thoughts around that during this workshop? Potentially no. So, okay, well, we have that one, and we have, you know, my one personal action. So one thing that maybe you can take out of this and take back to your workplace. So I'm happy to hear comments. I really invite comments from anybody to discuss either one of these prompts. So
I think my one action to address diversity in the workplace is just being really cognizant of the way that I act around others, make sure that it isn't biased or it isn't overtly or inherently sexist or gendered, exclusionary language, that kind of stuff, which I think would help build a more inclusive, welcoming work environment.
Mm-hmm. And I would say too that, you know, sometimes just planting the seeds in others. So if you hear a comment, say, well, actually, this could also be happening, right? They could also be, maybe she had a bad experience, right? Maybe somebody, you know, she's faced backlash before, or maybe she didn't leave for her kids. Maybe she left because, you know, remember that thing she didn't get credit for, or, right? So I think sometimes just starting to change the narrative in the workplace can help as well. Again, we're changing that assumption that everybody has the same bias, right? If we start saying, well, actually, people are trying to do better, so we need to try to do better, I think that can be really powerful. And the research shows that it's very powerful. So that is, I mean, that's what I have for y'all today. That's our workshop. So I certainly invite any questions, comments, observations, reactions. I mean, this is a topic that touches everybody, so you can't, I don't believe that it doesn't impact you.
Well, I'd like to say thank you so much, Dr. Langworthy. As you noted, this is the third in a series that we've held together, and this is the first digital one, so it's been interesting. Diversity in a I want to say post-COVID world, but unfortunately we're not there yet. But as we adapt to, you know, different work patterns, I think that also has a gendered component to it for sure. But I just want to thank you for taking the time to walk us through this information, for giving us so much to think about, and for giving us the tools to go back, you know, whether it's to a physical office or back to our Microsoft Teams meetings, and to think about what we can do and the roles that we play in making sure our workplaces are more inclusive and efficient.
Well, thank you. No, it's been my pleasure. I thank you all for listening, especially without, you know, the coffee breaks and the snacks that are usually associated with these kinds of workshops. So it's a lot of information. So I thank you all for your kind time and attention.
I think we've got a hand up.
Perfect.
Let's just have a check. Hi, Kifa, you're unmuted.
Yes, hi. I just want to add something very important, that as well women have to support women. So if women are on a leadership and management positions or board members, they need, since they are on that decision-making position, they need to start looking into mentoring, let's say, the young professionals, and prepare them and change all of these corporate culture that I was talking about. So I'm trying to pass a message to all of the women on this big positions or board members or leadership and senior management to start looking into taking care of other women as young professional and prepare them for such big, let's say, big positions, and give them, let's say, the empowerment to train themselves and themselves.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, and actually any leadership from that level helps, right? And unfortunately, right now we find ourselves in a world where it's mostly men in these positions. So we also want to invite the men to create that same environment. But certainly, if women board leaders and managers can drive it, then that's wonderful progress as well.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Langworthy. And we at the Pearl Initiative invite feedback on this webinar, and we invite you to join the other webinars that we're running over the course of this month and the next. You know, get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to speak with you about pretty much anything.
Okay. So I think with that, we're signing off, yes? So I thank you all again. I wish you a lovely day.